When my son told me I was not welcome for Christmas, I smiled, got in the car, and drove home. 2 days later, I had 30 missed calls. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family member who underestimated your worth and mistook your quiet generosity for weakness. My name is Calvin Foster. I am 68 years old and a retired director of logistics for a major freight corporation. My entire career was built on identifying inefficiencies, optimizing supply chains, and recognizing when a complex system was fundamentally broken. I spent 40 years calculating variables, predicting structural failures, and executing precise, emotionless solutions. Tonight, the one variable I failed to accurately calculate was the profound arrogance of my own son. The air on Christmas Eve was bitter, a dry, biting cold that cut straight through the thick wool of my overcoat. I stood alone on the expansive front porch of a sprawling suburban home in an affluent cul-de-sac just outside of Denver, Colorado. It was a beautiful, imposing property, the kind of real estate that signaled undeniable success, financial stability, and generational wealth. The front lawn was meticulously manicured, dusted with a fresh, sparkling layer of frost that glittered sharply under the glow of the expensive cast-iron street lamps lining the sidewalk. I adjusted my grip on the large, heavy cardboard box I carried against my chest. Inside were intricately wrapped gifts for my grandchildren, encased in thick red paper and secured with carefully tied silver ribbons. The box was cumbersome, pressing awkwardly against my ribs and restricting my breathing, but I held it steady. I could hear the muted, heavy thumping of festive holiday music vibrating through the thick, custom mahogany front door. Joyous laughter spilled out from the windows, warm and vibrant, cutting mercilessly through the freezing night air. Silhouettes of moving bodies danced across the drawn, expensive blinds of the formal dining room. A lavish holiday party was in full swing, completely insulated from the winter chill. I shifted my weight on the icy concrete of the porch, the leather soles of my shoes scraping softly. I did not ring the doorbell immediately. I simply stood there and observed. That was always my nature, my professional training overriding my personal impulses. I watched the heavy condensation from my breath form brief white clouds that vanished instantly into the dark void of the night. I listened to the clear sounds of clinking crystal glasses and the overlapping cheerful voices of a dozen people enjoying an opulent feast. I checked my wristwatch, pulling back the sleeve of my coat. It was exactly 7:55 in the evening. I had navigated the holiday traffic with my usual unwavering precision, arriving right on schedule for the family dinner we had supposedly agreed upon weeks ago. Or rather, the dinner I had completely assumed was a standing, unquestionable invitation, a fundamental expectation of the holiday season for a father and his only son. I finally reached forward with a numb finger and pressed the illuminated brass doorbell. The deep chime echoed loudly within the cavernous entryway of the house. The raucous laughter inside did not cease, but I quickly heard the distinct, heavy sound of footsteps approaching the door. The deadbolt clicked loudly. The heavy brass handle turned. The massive mahogany door swung inward immediately, releasing a sudden, overwhelming wave of warm air, scented heavily with roasted meat, expensive cinnamon, and fresh pine needles. The heat washed over my freezing face in a comforting wave, but the physical warmth of the house was instantly and brutally counteracted by the sheer impenetrable coldness of the man standing in the doorway. My son Aaron stood there in the frame. He was 34 years old, dressed impeccably in a crisp, tailored navy blazer and a pristine white dress shirt, left casually unbuttoned at the collar. He looked incredibly successful. He looked polished, refined, and entirely in control. But the precise moment his eyes registered my presence on his doorstep, his entire physical posture shifted drastically. His shoulders tightened into a rigid line. His jaw clenched so hard I could see the muscle jumping in his cheek. He did not smile. He did not extend a hand. He did not step aside to let his elderly father out of the freezing violent wind. Instead, he stepped forward aggressively, planting his expensive leather shoes firmly on the threshold, his body acting as a literal physical barricade between me and the warmth of the family home. The music pulsed loudly behind him. I could see the radiant glow of the massive 12-foot Christmas tree dominating the living room, adorned with hundreds of brilliant white lights and expensive crystal ornaments. I looked at my son silently, waiting for the customary greeting, waiting for the basic invitation to come inside out of the biting wind, waiting for him to reach out and help me with the heavy box of gifts that was steadily numbing my arms. Aaron did absolutely none of those things. He grabbed the heavy edge of the door, pulling it slightly inward, narrowing the gap actively and intentionally minimizing the amount of space I could see into the house. His eyes darted nervously over his shoulder, scanning the hallway behind him, with intense paranoia before snapping back to me. His breathing was visibly shallow. His facial expression was a highly volatile mixture of profound annoyance, deep embarrassment, and outright hostility. He looked down at the box in my hands, then slowly back up to my face. He did not say, "Merry Christmas." He did not say hello. He simply stared at me, actively blocking the entrance to the home, treating me not as a loving father arriving for a holiday celebration, but as an unexpected, entirely unwelcome delivery driver who had rudely interrupted a very private, exclusive gathering. The bitter wind howled violently behind me, whipping aggressively at the hem of my coat as I stood completely still on the frozen porch, waiting for a son who fundamentally refused to let his father through the door. The agonizing silence stretched between us, thick, heavy, and suffocating, broken only by the muffled sounds of the vibrant party carrying on oblivious behind his back. Aaron swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. His eyes flickered away from mine, completely refusing to hold my direct gaze. He shifted his weight uncomfortably from one foot to the other, his hand still gripping the edge of the door like a defensive shield against my presence. When he finally spoke, his voice was exceptionally low, hushed, as if he were deeply afraid the important people inside might overhear him talking to the pathetic man standing out in the freezing cold. "We were not expecting you, Dad." The words were delivered with a chilling, clinical detachment that defied belief. They hung suspended in the frosty air, freezing solid, before they even reached my ears. I stood perfectly still, the heavy cardboard box of gifts pressing painfully into my forearms. I looked at him, slowly processing the sheer magnitude of the statement. Not expecting me. On Christmas Eve. At the home of my only son. Aaron glanced over his shoulder again, his anxiety visibly spiking as a burst of laughter erupted from the dining room. "Brooke family is here," he continued, his tone hardening into a defensive, utterly arrogant edge. "It is an intimate thing. We only planned for the immediate family." Immediate family. The phrase echoed relentlessly in my mind, crashing against the walls of my skull. I did not blink. I did not react physically. I simply let the cruel words settle deeply into the logical, highly analytical framework of my brain. I looked straight past Aaron's shoulder. The hallway stretched out behind him, wide, expansive, and immaculate. My eyes traced the custom dark oak hardwood floors that gleamed flawlessly under the expensive recessed lighting. I looked at the intricate hand-crafted wainscoting that lined the pristine walls. I looked at the imported Italian marble of the grand entryway, my mind heavily conditioned by 4 decades of corporate logistics and meticulous financial auditing, instantly retrieved the exact undeniable figures. $120,000. That was the exact, precise amount of the certified cashier check I had personally handed over to the title company exactly 3 years ago. A direct, non-refundable wire transfer pulled straight from my personal retirement savings to cover the mandatory 20% down payment required to secure this exact sprawling suburban fortress. I had paid the exorbitant closing costs out of my own pocket. I had covered the expensive inspection fees without a second thought. My legal name was still officially listed as the primary on the deed of the property because Aaron's personal credit history had been completely insufficient to secure the massive mortgage on his own. I was the literal financial bedrock upon which this entire grand illusion of success was constructed. Yet standing here on the frozen concrete, listening to the holiday music pulse from the living room, I was being coldly informed that I did not qualify as immediate family. A sharp, distinct clicking of expensive high heels echoed from the corridor inside. I shifted my gaze slightly. Brooke, my 32-year-old daughter-in-law, stepped gracefully into the hallway. She was wearing a stunning, tailored emerald green silk dress, holding a delicate crystal champagne flute in her manicured hand. She stopped near the entrance of the dining room. She turned her head and looked directly at the front door. Her eyes met mine through the narrow opening Aaron allowed. There was absolutely no surprise in her expression. There was no confusion whatsoever. There was only a cold, highly calculated awareness. She knew exactly what was happening on the porch. She knew exactly why Aaron was blocking the door. She held my gaze for 3 excruciating, silent seconds. She did not wave. She did not smile. She did not utter a single word of greeting or apology. She simply raised her chin, turned on her heel with a dismissive, arrogant elegance, and walked casually back into the warmth and laughter of the party, disappearing completely from view. The absolute, undeniable finality of that gesture permanently cemented the reality of the situation. This was not a tragic miscommunication. This was not a foolish scheduling error. This was a deliberate, highly coordinated excision. They had orchestrated this lavish gathering specifically to exclude me. They had invited her entire extended family, catered a massive feast, and intentionally omitted the man who was literally financing the roof over their heads. Aaron watched my eyes meticulously track his wife. He turned back to me, his jaw setting defensively, physically bracing himself for a massive argument. He expected me to yell. He expected me to angrily demand entry. He expected me to throw the undeniable fact that I bought the house right in his face and force my way past him. He expected a messy, highly emotional father clinging desperately to his ungrateful, arrogant child. He expected a dramatic scene that would completely justify his arrogance and validate his cruel decision to treat me like a nuisance. He fundamentally misunderstood the man standing in front of him. A logistics director does not yell at a broken machine. A logistics director simply identifies the failing component, completely isolates it, and surgically removes it from the entire supply chain. I did not raise my voice a single decibel. I did not let a single ounce of the profound betrayal show on my face. I embraced an absolute terrifying quietude. I looked at Aaron carefully, studying the nervous beads of sweat forming on his brow, despite the freezing winter wind rushing continuously through the open door. I studied his extremely expensive clothes, his deeply defensive posture, the sheer, unadulterated arrogance radiating from his absolute refusal to invite me inside. I rapidly processed the incoming data. The relationship, acting as a functional reciprocal family unit, was completely and permanently defunct. The massive emotional and financial investment had yielded a completely negative return. The son I had painstakingly raised, the boy I had sacrificed decades of my life to protect, nurture, and aggressively provide for, no longer existed in reality. In his place stood an entitled, ungrateful stranger who viewed me merely as a silent, distant, and endlessly accommodating bank account. I smiled. It was not a warm paternal smile. It was a razor-thin, entirely pragmatic curve of the lips. The exact kind of smile you give an opponent across a high-stakes negotiation table when you suddenly realize they have just foolishly handed you the ultimate undeniable leverage. I slowly lowered the heavy cardboard box containing the meticulously wrapped gifts. I placed it gently, highly precisely on the frozen concrete, right at the very tip of Aaron's expensive polished leather shoes. The silver ribbons fluttered slightly, disturbed by the harsh winter wind. I stood back up calmly, adjusting the thick collar of my overcoat to block the chill. "Merry Christmas, Aaron," I said. My voice was perfectly level, utterly devoid of any anger, completely devoid of any sorrow. It was the calm, highly measured tone of a man confirming the termination of a massive contract. Aaron blinked repeatedly, his entire physical body visibly relaxed. He let out a deep breath he had clearly been holding in his chest, a profound, incredibly arrogant relief washing visibly over his features. He had aggressively braced for a miserable war, and instead, he foolishly believed he had won a total, entirely bloodless victory. He disastrously mistook my absolute silence for weak submission. He mistook my total calmness for a pathetic, cowardly retreat. He truly believed he had successfully banished me from the premises without a fight, establishing his absolute, unassailable dominance over our dynamic. "Thank you, Dad," he replied, his voice dripping with a sickening, highly condescending relief. "Drive safe. The roads are getting icy out there." He did not wait for me to turn around. He immediately began to close the heavy door. I did not linger on the porch for a single second. I turned my back to him and began the slow walk down the winding, beautifully paved driveway. Directly behind me, I heard the heavy, solid thud of the mahogany door clicking firmly shut. The deadbolt slid heavily into place with a sharp, extremely metallic finality. The vibrant, festive music was instantly muffled. The warm, inviting light spilling from the entryway vanished completely, leaving me entirely shrouded in the dark. The physical separation between us was now absolute. I walked steadily toward my car, my footsteps crunching loudly against the thick, frost-covered pavement. I did not look back at the grand house. I did not look up at the glowing decorated windows where Brooke family was currently drinking expensive champagne and laughing loudly in a home I legally owned. I simply walked. With every single step, the immense emotional weight of the betrayal evaporated rapidly into the freezing night, replaced entirely by a cold, searing, and absolute clarity. I reached my car, unlocked the door, and slid into the driver's seat. The leather was freezing against my back. The interior of the vehicle was completely silent and pitch dark. I pulled the door shut, sealing myself safely inside the quiet, isolated cabin. I gripped the cold steering wheel, staring straight ahead through the frosted windshield at the sprawling, incredibly wealthy neighborhood. For 3 long years, I had meticulously maintained this grand illusion for him. For 3 years, I had rigorously protected him from the harsh, crushing realities of the massive financial burdens he had so carelessly taken on. I had shielded him, I had supported him, and I had foolishly subsidized his growing arrogance. That era ended tonight. I reached forward with a steady hand and pressed the ignition button. The engine immediately roared to life, a steady, highly reliable hum cutting cleanly through the absolute silence of the suburban street. The modern dashboard illuminated instantly, casting a pale, clinical blue light across the dark cabin. My eyes immediately locked onto the digital clock, glowing brightly in the center console. It read exactly 8:00 p.m. I sat back heavily against the headrest, my mind rapidly and coldly sequencing the necessary operational steps required for the immediate future. The date was December 24th. For the past 36 consecutive months, without a single fail or delay, an automatic scheduled bank transfer of exactly $3,800 triggered from my primary checking account to completely cover the massive mortgage on the sprawling property Aaron and Brooke currently occupied. That specific transfer was strictly programmed by the bank to initiate precisely at midnight on the 25th of every single month to ensure the funds cleared well before the required deadline. I stared intensely at the glowing blue numbers of the clock. 8 p.m. I had exactly 4 hours. 4 hours before the massive banking servers executed the automated protocol. 4 hours before another massive, completely unearned infusion of my personal capital was silently and automatically deposited into the joint accounts of people who had just literally locked me out in the freezing cold and arrogantly declared I was not part of their family. I shifted my right hand to the center console and firmly pulled the heavy gear selector downward into drive. The tires gripped the frosty asphalt securely as I pulled away from the manicured curb. I did not drive with reckless anger. I drove with the steady, unyielding, and absolute precision of a senior executive actively executing a ruthless, highly calculated hostile takeover. The internal transition within me was entirely complete. I was no longer a discarded, heartbroken father, desperately seeking basic affection from an ungrateful, entitled son. I was now the primary financial stakeholder, deliberately moving to aggressively liquidate a highly toxic asset. The impending war had not been successfully avoided by his closed door. It had simply been delayed by precisely 4 hours. The drive from the wealthy suburb back to my side of town took exactly 24 minutes. I did not turn on the radio. I did not turn on the heater. The silence in the cabin of my car was absolute, and I allowed it to settle over me, freezing the last remaining fragments of paternal sentiment into solid, unbreakable ice. I pulled into the narrow driveway of my townhouse. It was a modest, unassuming unit constructed of gray brick and slate siding. There were no imported marble entryways here. There were no soaring columns or wrought iron gates. I preferred it that way. It was efficient, practical, and it required zero unnecessary maintenance. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The air in my living room was stale and quiet. In the corner of the room stood a small, artificial Christmas tree. I had set it up 2 weeks ago, dutifully pulling it from its cardboard box in the garage, anticipating the holiday with my family. Its lights were currently unplugged, leaving the plastic branches completely swallowed by the shadows. I did not reach out to plug them in. The time for festive illusions had officially expired. I took off my heavy wool overcoat, draping it precisely over the back of a dining chair. I did not sit on the comfortable sofa. I bypassed the living area entirely and walked straight into the small spare room I utilized as a home office. This room was my sanctuary. It contained a solid oak desk, a leather office chair, and a high-performance desktop computer hooked up to dual monitors. For 40 years in the logistics industry, this was the exact kind of environment where I solved catastrophic supply chain failures. Whenever a vendor breached a contract, whenever a transportation network collapsed, I sat in a chair. Just like this one, isolated the broken variables and severed the dead weight. Tonight, the failing vendor was my own son. I pressed the power button on the computer tower. The cooling fans whirred to life a steady mechanical drone that grounded me. The dual screens flared bright white, illuminating my face in the dark room. I sat down and placed my hands flat on the smooth surface of the desk. I needed to act with total, unclouded objectivity. Aaron had just demonstrated that he believed he operated entirely independently of me. He truly believed his success was entirely his own creation. He had looked me in the eye and confidently barred me from a house that existed solely because of my capital. It was time to introduce him to the brutal mathematical reality of his existence. I opened my secure web browser and navigated straight to the portal of my primary financial institution. I typed in my complex alphanumeric password with rapid practiced keystrokes. The 2-factor authentication code buzzed on my phone. I entered the 6 digits and the main dashboard loaded instantly across my primary monitor. My eyes scanned the clean, organized rows of financial data. I managed my retirement assets with the exact same ruthless oversight I had applied to corporate budgets. Every dollar had a designated purpose, a scheduled trajectory, and an expected return on investment. I moved my cursor directly to the tab labeled Scheduled Outbound Transfers. The page refreshed, displaying a single massive recurring transaction. The destination account was listed under the name Aaron Foster. The scheduled execution date was tomorrow, December 25th, exactly at midnight. The exact transfer amount was $3,800. I stared at that specific number. $3,800. Every single month for the past 36 months, that exact sum had silently drained from my hard-earned retirement reserves and flowed seamlessly into my son account, strictly to ensure his colossal mortgage remained in good standing. When Aaron first came to me 3 years ago pleading for help with the down payment, I had audited his income. I knew instantly that his salary as a regional sales manager was vastly insufficient to cover the monthly payments, the exorbitant property taxes, and the massive upkeep of such an affluent estate. But he had looked at me with those desperate, hopeful eyes, promising he was up for a major promotion, swearing this house was the only way Brooke would agree to start a family. So I had stepped in as the silent, invisible benefactor. I had legally placed myself on the deed to secure the loan, and I had quietly set up this automated transfer to shield him from the crushing weight of his own financial overreach. I had done it out of blind, foolish love. But love, like any operational asset, must be immediately revoked when it is actively weaponized against the provider. I moved my mouse over the blue highlighted text of the recurring transfer. A drop-down menu appeared. I bypassed the options to edit or pause the transaction. I moved the cursor down to the final red option labeled Permanently Cancel Transaction. I clicked the left mouse button. A secondary warning screen popped up, an automated safeguard, asking me to confirm this permanent action, warning me that future scheduled payments would not be processed and could result in severe late fees. I did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. I clicked Confirm. The screen flashed briefly, loading a green checkmark. The scheduled transfer of $3,800 simply vanished from the active ledger. Just like that, the invisible safety net that had kept Aaron's perfectly manicured life suspended above total ruin was entirely eradicated. But a logistics director knows that a single severed line is never enough to fully dismantle a fundamentally broken system. You must isolate all auxiliary lines of support to prevent further structural damage. I moved my attention to the Credit Management tab on my dashboard. I opened the profile for the Joint Platinum Emergency Credit Card. 2 years ago, Aaron called me in an absolute panic, claiming his car transmission had blown, and he had absolutely zero liquidity to cover the immediate repair. I had opened this specific line of credit, tying it directly to my pristine credit score, and mailed the physical card to his address. The strict verbal agreement was that this card was to be used exclusively for catastrophic emergencies and essential groceries if they were ever temporarily short on cash. I navigated to the cardholder control settings on the portal. There was a simple toggle switch on the screen labeled Temporarily Lock Card. I ignored it entirely. I scrolled down to the security options and selected the protocol for a stolen card. I clicked the button to permanently freeze the account and instantly revoke all current authorized users. Another confirmation screen appeared, warning me that any cards currently in circulation would be immediately declined at any point of sale. I clicked Confirm. The status of the Platinum card instantly changed from active to frozen. The digital guillotine had officially fallen. I leaned back in my heavy leather chair, taking a slow, deep breath of the cool, recycled air in my office. My financial liability was now completely sealed. I had successfully severed the massive arteries of cash flowing blindly into Aaron's household. However, looking at the frozen credit account on the glowing monitor, a sudden cold curiosity gripped me. The current outstanding balance on that supposed emergency card was significantly higher than it should have been. To verify the absolute necessity of my defensive maneuvers, I needed to know exactly how much damage had been done before I dropped the blade. I reached forward and clicked on the detailed transaction history for the frozen card, fully prepared to initiate a ruthless forensic audit of my son's recent expenditures. The blue light of the monitor cast a pale, clinical glow across the dark office. The confirmation screen faded, replaced by the primary dashboard of the credit account. The digital padlock icon indicated the Platinum card was successfully frozen, severing their access to the funds. But the outstanding balance displayed in the upper right corner demanded my immediate attention. The numbers sat there, bold and accusatory against the white background. $42,815. I stared at the sum, the rhythmic hum of the computer tower, the only sound in the silent townhouse. The absolute credit limit on that specific account was $50,000. They had nearly exhausted the entire line of credit. I moved the mouse, the faint click echoing sharply in the quiet room. I navigated to the transaction history tab. I did not approach this as a father looking at his son's financial mistakes. I approached this exactly as I had approached 40 years of corporate logistics. I was conducting a forensic audit of a failing asset. I needed to isolate the exact points of hemorrhage. I clicked the button to generate the statements for the past 12 months, downloading the raw data directly to my hard drive. I opened the first document. The original arrangement established exactly 24 months ago was explicitly clear. Aaron had called me on a Tuesday evening, his voice tight with manufactured panic. His car transmission had supposedly failed, leaving him stranded and unable to commute to his sales job. He swore his checking account was overdrawn, claiming that unexpected medical bills for Brooke had wiped them out. I had listened, I had believed him, and I had acted. I overnighted the platinum card to their address with one strict, unbending parameter. The account was for absolute emergencies only. It was a safety net for critical automotive repairs, sudden medical expenses, or essential groceries if they were ever truly starving before payday. It was never intended to subsidize their daily existence. My eyes tracked down the first page of the most recent billing cycle. I looked for the name of a local mechanic. I looked for a single transaction at a standard supermarket, a charge for bread, milk, or basic necessities. There were none. Instead, my eyes locked onto a charge dated exactly 3 weeks ago. $850 at a high-end exclusive day spa located in the most affluent district of downtown Denver. I highlighted the line item. I cross-referenced the date in my mind. 3 weeks ago, Aaron had called to ask if I could cover the cost of a plumber because their hot water heater had allegedly ruptured. While I was transferring emergency funds from my checking account to keep my son from freezing in his own home, Brooke was spending nearly $1,000 of my credit on hot stone massages and imported facial treatments. I scrolled down the wheel of the mouse, clicking methodically. The pattern of deception was not hidden. It was brazen. It was the spending habit of someone operating with total unchecked impunity. November 14th showed $1,200 at a boutique designer clothing store. November 18th showed $400 at an upscale steakhouse, a charge made on a Thursday night when Aaron had explicitly told me he was working a grueling double shift to try and make ends meet. November 22nd displayed $2,500, paid directly to a private, extremely exclusive country club. I stopped scrolling. I pulled up the detailed receipt for the country club transaction. It was not a one-time guest fee. It was the recurring monthly membership due, complete with a massive dining room tab heavily itemized with vintage wines and premium imported steaks. I leaned back in the leather chair, feeling the absolute weight of their arrogance settle over me. A country club membership. They were actively socializing with the Denver elite, projecting the pristine image of a wealthy, successful young couple, while I sat alone in my modest townhouse, silently paying the bill for their performative lifestyle. I opened the statement from October. The data told a story completely divorced from the narrative Aaron fed me over our brief, hurried phone calls. October 9th revealed $3,000 for premium business class airline tickets to Aspen. October 11th through the 15th showed $4,500 at a luxury ski resort. I distinctly remembered that specific week. Aaron had canceled our scheduled Sunday lunch, claiming he was completely overwhelmed with a massive project at work and that Brooke was battling a severe flu. He had sounded so exhausted on the phone, so utterly defeated by the pressures of providing for his family. I had felt a deep paternal ache for him. I had even offered to send over soup and medicine. He had quickly declined, insisting they just needed rest. The raw financial data glowed brightly on my monitor, completely shattering the illusion of the struggling son. They were not resting. They were not sick. They were sitting in a luxury ski lodge, drinking expensive champagne, charging every single drop of their opulent vacation to the emergency credit card of the elderly father they had left sitting alone at home. The betrayal was not a sudden, violent act. It was a slow, methodical, and entirely calculated extraction. I opened the September statement, then August, then July. The exact same pattern repeated with sickening consistency. Thousands of dollars funneled into designer boutiques, high-end cosmetic procedures, and lavish entertainment. They had not simply bent the rules of our financial arrangement. They had completely obliterated them. They viewed me precisely as I had feared earlier on that freezing porch. I was not a father. I was a machine. I was a silent, endlessly generating engine of capital perfectly designed to fund their boundless vanity. They operated under the absolute assumption that I was too old, too naive, or simply too desperate for their affection to ever check the actual ledgers. They believed my love for Aaron would permanently blind me to the glaring mathematical inconsistencies of their lifestyle. They thought they could continually extract my resources while simultaneously treating me with the profound, chilling disrespect I had experienced just hours ago at their front door. They assumed my silence was a permanent symptom of weakness. I did not feel the sting of sorrow. The time for emotional vulnerability had expired the moment Brooke turned her back on me in that mahogany hallway. What I felt now was a cold, razor-sharp focus. Every single transaction I highlighted on the screen was a nail sealing the coffin of our relationship. I compiled the statements, saving the files into a newly created folder on my desktop labeled simply Evidence. I had successfully severed the massive monthly mortgage transfer. I had permanently frozen the bleeding artery of the Platinum credit card. Their entire financial ecosystem built entirely on my stolen credit and unearned capital was now completely cut off from the source. The resulting collapse would be swift, brutal, and entirely of their own making. I closed out of the credit card portal, the screen returning to my primary banking dashboard. I prepared to shut down the computer and finally get some sleep. The initial phase of the excision was complete. But as my cursor hovered over the log out button, a small blinking red icon in the top left corner of the screen caught my attention. It was a high priority alert from my integrated credit monitoring service, a service I had enrolled in decades ago and rarely ever needed to check. I paused, my hand hovering over the mouse. The alert was flagged as urgent, timestamped exactly 3 weeks prior, buried under a pile of routine digital notifications I had previously ignored. I clicked on the red icon. The page loaded slowly, the spinning wheel a stark contrast to the rapid acceleration of my pulse. I had audited the credit card. I had severed the mortgage. But as the secure message finally opened on the screen, revealing the details of the urgent credit inquiry, I realized with absolute horrifying clarity that the financial exploitation I had just uncovered was merely the shallow surface of a much deeper, far more dangerous crime. The red alert icon blinked steadily in the upper corner of my screen. I moved my mouse and clicked the notification. The secure message center of my credit monitoring portal loaded with agonizing slowness. I watched the spinning blue circle, my mind already running through the standard possibilities. An accidental flag. A minor identity ping. I had maintained an immaculate credit score for over 4 decades. I possessed 0 outstanding debt outside of the primary mortgage I carried for Aaron. I owned my townhouse completely outright. I did not casually apply for revolving credit. The page finally populated, displaying a single highly detailed alert. It was a formal notification of a hard credit inquiry initiated exactly 21 days ago. The originating institution was not my standard highly regulated national bank. It was a regional credit union located across the city, a branch specifically known for aggressively approving high-risk, rapid cash loans. I leaned closer to the dual monitors. The alert specified the exact nature of the inquiry. It was an application for a home equity line of credit. The officially approved amount was $75,000. The collateral legally listed to secure this massive line of credit was the sprawling suburban property currently occupied by my son and his wife. I sat perfectly motionless in my leather chair. My breathing slowed to a deliberate, shallow rhythm. I applied the exact same ruthless structural logic I used in corporate logistics to the information glowing on the screen. I broke down the legal architecture of the asset. I had provided the $120,000 down payment for that property. My legal name and my name alone sat as the primary holder on the actual deed. Aaron was classified merely as a secondary occupant. He possessed absolutely zero legal authority to leverage that property for cash. In order to legally secure a $75,000 equity loan against that specific house, the credit union would absolutely require the primary deed holder to authorize the paperwork. They would require my physical presence, my state-issued identification, or a heavily authenticated digital signature. I had provided none of those things. I had not spoken to anyone at that regional credit union. The logical conclusion materialized with terrifying clarity. Aaron had not simply bypassed my authority. He had actively and deliberately impersonated me. He had forged my signature on federal financial documents to illegally extract liquid cash from an asset he did not own. The air in my home office suddenly felt incredibly thin. The previous discoveries regarding the joint credit card had been appalling, but they were ultimately ethical failures. Spending my money on luxury spa retreats and expensive country club dinners was a spectacular display of entitlement. It was greed. It was a profound moral failing. But this was entirely different. This was a felony. This was wire fraud, identity theft, and severe elder financial exploitation executed in a single breathtakingly arrogant maneuver. My own son had crossed the line from a dependent parasite into a desperate active criminal. I looked at the exact date of the hard inquiry. 21 days ago. My mind instantly rewound the calendar, accessing my immaculate memory for schedules and appointments. 21 days ago was the week of Thanksgiving. A vivid, sickeningly clear memory surfaced. Aaron had invited me over for a surprisingly brief, casual dinner on a Tuesday evening, just before the holiday. I remembered sitting at his expensive kitchen island. Brooke had conveniently excused herself to run errands. Aaron had poured me a glass of wine, acting unusually warm and conversational. Midway through the evening, he had pulled a thick stack of complex tax documents from his briefcase, claiming they pertained to a complicated new compensation package at his sales job. He told me he needed a reliable character reference signature for a background check his new corporate clients required. He had seamlessly fanned out the pages, isolating a single signature line at the very bottom of a dense text-heavy document. I had signed it. I had blindly placed my pen on the paper and signed my legal name, completely trusting my own flesh and blood. He had slipped the loan authorization page directly into a stack of fake corporate paperwork. He had looked me directly in the eye, handed me a glass of wine, and smoothly guided my hand to execute the instrument of my own financial ruin. He had weaponized my absolute unconditional trust to steal $75,000 in liquid cash. And then exactly 3 weeks later, he had stood on his frozen front porch, physically blocked me from entering his home, and coldly informed me that I was not immediate family. I did not slam my fists against the oak desk. I did not shout at the empty room. I experienced a profound glacial shift in my internal operational parameters. The father who had tirelessly subsidized his son's life officially ceased to exist. I was now a primary stakeholder dealing with a hostile, deeply criminal adversary who was actively working to strip my assets. I navigated away from the credit monitoring site and went directly to the web portal for the regional credit union. Using the reference numbers provided in the alert, I initiated a direct emergency fraud lockdown on the newly opened equity line. I bypassed the standard customer service prompts and utilized the automated federal fraud reporting tools. Within 3 minutes, the $75,000 account was frozen, flagged for active identity theft, and locked pending a mandatory federal investigation. I did not stop there. I meticulously downloaded the digital copies of the fraudulent application, the time-stamped login addresses, and the scanned copies of the forged signature pages. I saved every single piece of raw data directly into the encrypted evidence folder on my desktop. Every digital fingerprint he had carelessly left behind was now safely isolated, secured, and ready for deployment. I glanced at the clock on my office wall. The second hand swept past the 12. It was officially midnight on Christmas morning. The automated mortgage transfer had officially failed to execute. The joint credit card was completely dead, and the fraudulent equity line was now flagged as a federal crime in the banking system. The financial ecosystem that supported their extreme arrogance had been entirely eradicated. I picked up my cell phone from the desk. The time for silent observation was over. It was time to initiate the counteroffensive. The digital clock on the corner of my desk flipped silently to 6 in the morning. Outside my window, the sky was a deep, impenetrable black holding no promise of the dawn. It was Christmas morning. By every normal societal metric, I should have been sleeping deeply, or perhaps waking up to the smell of roasted coffee and the quiet joy of a holiday spent with loved ones. Instead, I sat perfectly still in the harsh artificial glow of my dual monitors. I had not slept a single minute. I did not feel the slightest trace of physical fatigue. My mind was operating at a level of absolute crystalline clarity that I had not experienced since my days overseeing massive global logistics networks. The father who had driven to a wealthy suburb mere hours ago hoping for a scrap of familial affection was entirely gone. He had been surgically removed from my psyche. In his place sat a corporate director who had just uncovered a massive internal embezzlement scheme. I spent the early hours of the morning meticulously organizing the digital evidence. I did not waste time looking at old family photographs or wondering where I had gone wrong in raising my son. That kind of emotional indulgence was a useless metric. I focused entirely on the raw data. I printed the time-stamped bank logs showing the exact moment the fraudulent equity line was initiated. I printed the login locations that perfectly matched the network address of Aaron's sprawling suburban estate. Finally, I printed the scanned copy of the signature page from the loan application. I stared at the ink. It was my name perfectly mimicking the rhythmic slant of my handwriting, but executed on a document I had never authorized. I placed the papers into a pristine manila folder, aligning the edges with absolute precision. The physical proof of my son committing a federal crime was now ready for deployment. I reached across the desk and picked up my cell phone. I bypassed my personal contacts list entirely. I scrolled down to my professional directory and stopped on the name Stephen Porter. Stephen was not a soft-spoken family attorney who mediated gentle disputes or negotiated peaceful emotional settlements. Stephen was a highly aggressive corporate litigator. I had utilized his firm extensively during my career to execute hostile takeovers, liquidate failing subsidiaries, and mercilessly prosecute vendors who breached our contracts. He was a man completely devoid of sentiment, who dealt exclusively in leverage liabilities and total asset recovery. He was a shark in a tailored suit. Calling him on a holiday was the ultimate declaration of my intent. This was no longer a family dispute. This was the systematic dismantling of a hostile entity. I pressed the call button and brought the phone to my ear. I knew he would not answer at 6 in the morning on a major holiday. I did not want him to answer. A voicemail provided a clean recorded operational directive without the need for empty pleasantries. The phone rang 3 times before connecting to his automated professional greeting. The recording tone sounded loud and sharp in the quiet room. "Stephen, it is Calvin." I spoke with a voice completely stripped of any warmth or hesitation. "Aaron forged my signature for a $75,000 home equity line of credit. Draft the 30-day eviction notices and freeze the deed. We go to war on Monday." I pulled the phone away from my ear and ended the call. The finality of that action settled heavily over the room, but it did not bring a single ounce of sorrow. It brought a profound, immense sense of order. The sprawling suburban house, the grand illusion of his massive success, the carefully curated image he projected to his wealthy neighbors, it was all built on a foundation of stolen money and federal wire fraud. I had just initiated the legal mechanism that would detonate that foundation completely. I stood up from my heavy leather desk chair. My joints were slightly stiff from sitting perfectly rigid through the entire night, but my posture was entirely straight. I walked into my small dark kitchen and began brewing a pot of black coffee. I did not turn on the television to watch cheerful holiday parades. I did not look out the window to see happy neighbors exchanging gifts. I simply sat at my modest kitchen island, poured my dark, bitter coffee, and waited. I had completely severed his mortgage payment. I had permanently deactivated his primary emergency credit card. I had locked down the fraudulent equity line and triggered an active federal fraud investigation. I had legally weaponized the deed to the home he slept in. The financial oxygen had been totally and permanently cut off. I knew precisely how the remaining variables would react. Aaron and Brooke were currently sleeping in their lavish master bedroom, completely oblivious to the fact that their entire manufactured reality had just been ruthlessly liquidated. They believed they had won. They truly believed they had successfully discarded an annoying, powerless old man. It would take exactly 48 hours for the global banking systems to process the sheer absolute magnitude of the destruction I had unleashed. I took a slow, steady sip of my coffee and prepared my mind for the absolute frantic panic that was mathematically guaranteed to follow. The silence in my townhouse was perfect right now, but I knew the storm was already gathering momentum. Christmas Day arrived without a single notification. No text message appeared on my screen. No obligatory holiday greeting was transmitted. My cell phone sat completely silent on the edge of the kitchen island. In previous years, I would have found this absolute quiet deeply unsettling. I would have manufactured a weak excuse to call them, hoping to catch the voices of my grandchildren in the background. Now the silence was incredibly validating. It was the absolute mathematical confirmation of my hypothesis. Without my ongoing financial utility, I simply ceased to exist in their reality. The 26th of December arrived and departed with the exact same profound emptiness. I spent those 48 hours executing my daily routines with military precision. I cleared the heavy snow from my narrow driveway. I organized my physical tax files into neat chronological stacks. I prepared simple, highly efficient meals. I did not log into my banking portals a single time. The automated cancellation protocols I had initiated were entirely infallible and required absolutely no further micromanagement. I had cleanly severed the primary supply lines, and now I merely had to wait for the vacuum to suffocate the parasite. The 27th of December dawned bitterly cold and completely dark. I woke precisely at 5 in the morning. I showered, shaved, and dressed in a clean pressed shirt and slacks. A retired director of corporate logistics never meets a crisis in his pajamas. I walked into the kitchen and began my morning ritual. I ground the dark roast coffee beans, measuring the exact ratio of water to grounds. The machine sputtered and hissed, filling the small room with a rich, heavy aroma. I poured the black liquid into a thick ceramic mug. I walked over to the kitchen island and stood perfectly still. My cell phone rested exactly where I had left it. The digital clock on the screen shifted to 7:30 in the morning. In the affluent, sprawling suburbs where Aaron and Brooke resided, 7:30 was the precise hour the world demanded its payment. It was the exact time their automated luxury lifestyle began aggressively interacting with the global financial grid. The local artisan coffee shops, the premium fitness subscription services, the automated electronic tolls for their expensive vehicles all began pinging their accounts for daily authorization. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee. The bitter heat washed over my tongue. At exactly 7:34, the black screen of my cell phone suddenly illuminated. A bright, intrusive block of light shattered the calm shadows of the kitchen. The device began to vibrate violently against the granite countertop, emitting a sharp, demanding ringtone. I did not reach for it. I stood entirely motionless, my hands wrapped securely around the warm ceramic of my mug. The caller identification flashed across the screen in bold, glaring letters. It was Aaron. The phone rang loudly, echoing off the hardwood cabinets. It rang a second time, then a third. It continued its frantic demand until it finally clicked over to my automated voicemail system. The screen went dark. the silence returned to the kitchen. It lasted for exactly 42 seconds. The screen violently illuminated again. The identical caller identification flashed. The identical frantic vibration rattled against the stone counter. I took another slow, calculated sip of my coffee. The digital guillotine had officially dropped. The catastrophic financial shockwaves were currently ripping through their pristine morning routine. Perhaps Brooke was standing at the polished front desk of her exclusive Pilates studio, facing a mortified receptionist, while holding a violently declined platinum credit card. Perhaps Aaron was logging into his mobile banking application in a cold sweat to discover the massive mortgage transfer had completely failed to post, and his primary checking accounts were severely overdrawn. The phone clicked over to voicemail a second time. It immediately began to ring a third time. I watched the missed call notification pop up on the lock screen. 3 missed calls. I did not feel the slightest urge to answer the device. Answering would provide them with an immediate emotional target for their panic. It would allow them to redirect their sheer terror into entitled blinding rage against me. Absolute silence, on the other hand, forces a hostile entity to confront the terrifying absolute reality of their sudden isolation. The phone rang a 4th time. A 5th. A 6th. The intervals between the incoming calls grew increasingly shorter and far more erratic. The aggressive vibration against the granite became a continuous, desperate drone. 9 missed calls. 12 missed calls. I walked around the kitchen island, pulling out a wooden stool. I sat down deliberately, keeping my eyes locked entirely on the glowing digital screen. 15 missed calls. The sheer desperation radiating from the small device was almost palpable. They were finally realizing that the bottomless, reliable well of my capital had instantly and permanently dried up. 20 missed calls. I imagined Aaron pacing his expansive custom kitchen, dialing frantically, completely unable to comprehend a universe where his father absolutely refused to absorb his massive liabilities. He was a man who had never faced a single structural consequence in his adult life. 25 missed calls. The coffee in my mug was beginning to cool, but I did not break my intense focus. I watched the red notification badge swell with incoming voicemails. 28. 29. The phone began to ring once more. I watched my son's name flash across the screen for the 30th consecutive time. I waited with absolute patience for the final ring to conclude. The screen went black, and the notification cemented itself at exactly 30 missed calls. The initial storm of absolute panic had finally crested. The structural collapse was now irreversible. I listened to the silence that followed the 30th call. It was a profound, absolute quiet. In my decades of managing global supply chains, I had learned that the most critical moment of any catastrophic failure is not the initial breach. It is the immediate aftermath, when the failing components realize no rescue protocol has been initiated. I knew exactly what was happening on their end of the cellular network. The arrogant denial was rapidly mutating into raw, existential dread. They were currently scrambling to access alternative lines of credit, finding each one systematically blocked or entirely exhausted by their own gluttony. They were refreshing their banking applications over and over, praying for a miraculous digital glitch that would restore their stolen equilibrium. I took the final sip of my lukewarm coffee and set the ceramic mug down onto the granite counter with a soft, dull thud. The preparation phase of my operation was officially concluded. They had spent 3 entire years treating me as an invisible automated resource, completely devoid of human value. Now they were about to experience exactly what happens when that resource gains total sentience and deliberately decides to execute a total system purge. The glowing screen of my cellular phone finally rested on the number 30. The relentless vibrating against the granite countertop ceased entirely, leaving a profound, heavy silence in the kitchen. I did not move immediately. I allowed the quiet to settle around me. I finished the last few drops of my black coffee and set the ceramic mug directly into the sink. I dried my hands on a cloth towel. Only then did I walk back to the kitchen island and pick up the device. I unlocked the screen and opened the voicemail application. The digital ledger displayed a long, cascading list of audio recordings. Every single one originated from Aaron. I did not feel the familiar anxious pull of a father worried about his child. I felt the absolute detached focus of a corporate auditor reviewing a sequence of critical systemic failures. I pressed play on the very first message recorded at exactly 10:15 in the morning. The audio began with a sharp, irritated sigh. I could instantly hear the distinct ambient noise of a high-end retail environment in the background. Soft classical music played faintly through overhead speakers. The muted, polite chatter of affluent shoppers echoed around him. Aaron's voice came through the speaker, dripping with a heavy, suffocating layer of absolute condescension. He did not ask how my holiday was. He did not say good morning. He simply launched into a deeply entitled reprimand. He demanded to know why the Joint Platinum emergency card had just been violently declined at the register. He explained with intense irritation that they were attending an exclusive post-Christmas designer clearance event. He stated that Brooke was currently standing at a checkout counter, being profoundly publicly humiliated because the terminal kept flashing a restricted account error. In the background of the recording, I could hear Brooke hissing something completely unintelligible but undeniably furious right next to the receiver. Aaron spoke to me as if I were a negligent, low-level employee who had carelessly forgotten to run a mandatory software update. He ordered me to call my financial institution immediately. He told me to fix whatever technical glitch I had caused and to call him back the exact second the funds were restored. The recording ended with a sharp, angry click. I did not flinch. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt for Brooke's public embarrassment. The money they were attempting to spend on designer garments was stolen directly from my retirement reserves. The restriction was not a technical glitch. It was a permanent financial blockade. I pressed the delete icon and moved down the chronological list. I skipped past a dozen repetitive, angry messages demanding to know why I was ignoring his calls. I isolated the next significant shift in his tone recorded at exactly 1:45 in the afternoon. I pressed play. The acoustic environment of this recording was entirely different. The soft retail music was gone. The background was silent except for the low, steady rumble of a luxury vehicle engine idling. Aaron was sitting alone inside his expensive sports utility vehicle. The entitled arrogance that saturated his first message had completely evaporated. In its place was a creeping, undeniable anxiety. His voice was noticeably tighter. He was speaking much faster, tripping slightly over his own words. He informed me that he had just received an automated alert from his primary lending institution. The massive $3,800 mortgage payment had completely failed to clear. The bank had officially issued a default warning. Aaron desperately tried to rationalize this catastrophic failure. He nervously suggested that I must have made a foolish error with my online banking settings. He tried to blame my age, claiming I probably clicked the wrong button and accidentally disrupted the automated routing numbers. He ordered me to manually wire the funds to his checking account immediately before a severe penalty was applied to his pristine credit score. He was still desperately trying to cling to the grand illusion of his independence. He still fundamentally believed that I was simply a confused elderly man who had made a clerical error. He could not fathom the terrifying reality that his primary financial host had purposefully severed the parasite. I pressed the delete icon again, erasing his anxiety from my digital archive. I skipped to the very last voicemail on the list left only minutes ago. I pressed the play button and held the phone close to my ear. This was the exact moment the absolute true terror had finally set in. Aaron was practically hyperventilating. His breathing was ragged and shallow, echoing loudly into the microphone. His voice cracked violently, completely stripped of any remaining dignity or corporate refinement. He was no longer demanding a solution. He was begging for a rescue. The bank had just contacted him directly on his private cellular line. The representative had informed him that the massive $75,000 home equity line of credit had been permanently frozen. The account was not experiencing a technical error. It had been actively locked down by the Federal Fraud Department for suspected identity theft and severe financial exploitation. Aaron stammered blindly through the recording. He told me the fraud investigators were actively reviewing the digital signatures. He told me the local authorities might be legally compelled to investigate the fraudulent origin of the loan. He demanded that I call the bank this exact second. He begged me to tell the federal investigators that the entire situation was a massive family misunderstanding. He wanted me to call the authorities and lie on his behalf. He actually expected me to willingly cover up a federal felony simply because he was my son. He expected me to absorb the absolute liability of his criminal actions to protect the fragile, opulent lifestyle he had built entirely on a foundation of my stolen capital. I listened to the sheer, unadulterated panic in his voice as he realized the walls of his fraudulent empire were rapidly collapsing inward. He was facing total financial ruin, forced eviction, and potential federal indictment, all within a span of 48 hours. The voicemail automatically ended, cutting off his desperate, frantic pleading. The kitchen returned to a state of total, absolute silence. I slowly lowered the cellular phone and placed it face down on the cold granite countertop. I did not feel the slightest trace of pity. I had successfully audited the cascading sequence of his destruction. Every single voicemail served as undeniable concrete confirmation of a flawlessly executed tactical strike. The digital guillotine had functioned with absolute mechanical perfection. The immediate threat was neutralized, but the overall operation was far from complete. I turned away from the kitchen island and walked directly toward the front closet. I reached out and pulled my heavy wool overcoat from the wooden hanger. I had gathered all the necessary intelligence. The enemy was completely disoriented and rapidly hemorrhaging resources. It was time to leave the quiet sanctuary of my townhouse. It was time to travel downtown and sit in the war room with my attorney. I slipped my arms into the thick sleeves of my coat, preparing to finish the complete eradication of my son. The elevator ascended to the 42nd floor with a smooth, silent velocity. The stainless steel doors parted to reveal the reception area of Porter and Vance litigation. It was precisely 8 in the morning on the Monday following the holiday weekend. The receptionist was absent. The glass walls offered a sprawling panoramic view of the frozen downtown skyline, but I did not stop to admire the architecture. I walked directly down the polished marble corridor toward the corner office. I did not knock. I pushed the heavy oak door open and stepped inside. Stephen Porter was already seated behind his massive glass desk. He did not offer a manufactured smile. He did not ask how my weekend was or utter a single empty platitude regarding the season. He wore a sharply tailored charcoal suit and stared intently at the glowing screen of his laptop. A thick printed file sat perfectly centered on his desk. It was the encrypted digital package I had transmitted to his secure server 2 days ago. "Have a seat, Calvin." Stephen spoke without looking up from his monitor. His voice was a flat, gravelly baritone entirely stripped of emotion. I sat in the leather chair opposite him. I did not remove my wool overcoat. I simply waited. Stephen closed the laptop and placed his hands flat on the glass surface. He looked directly at me with the calculating eyes of a predator analyzing a wounded carcass. "I reviewed the entire data packet you compiled, the digital login timestamps, the network routing addresses, the scanned application from the regional credit union. I cross-referenced the document metadata with the forged signature page and the legal classification. I asked, my voice mirroring his absolute detachment. "It is a bloodbath," Stephen replied, leaning slightly forward. "Your son did not merely bend a few internal banking rules. By electronically transmitting a forged signature to secure a $75,000 equity loan against an asset he does not own, he has triggered a multitude of severe federal and state statutes. We are looking at aggravated identity theft. We are looking at first-degree felony forgery. Because the credit union is a federally insured institution, The electronic submission elevates this directly to federal wire fraud. Furthermore, given your age bracket, he has officially crossed the threshold into severe elder financial exploitation. Stephen paused, letting the sheer weight of the legal terminology settle in the quiet room. If the district attorney decides to pursue this aggressively, and given the immaculate paper trail you have provided, your son is facing a mandatory minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary. It is not a fine, Calvin. It is not probation. It is hard time. I processed the information with the same cold analytical precision I used to evaluate quarterly profit margins. I felt absolutely no instinct to shield him. He had willingly stepped into a minefield and confidently jumped on the largest explosive he could find. I am not interested in initiating criminal proceedings today, I stated, keeping my gaze locked on Stephen. Criminal investigations take months. They involve detectives, grand juries, and endless bureaucratic delays. Aaron would use that time to manipulate his wife, borrow money from her affluent family, and construct an elaborate narrative of victimhood. I do not want to give him a timeline. I want to execute a total systemic shock. I want his entire operational reality dismantled immediately. Stephen tilted his head, a faint glimmer of professional appreciation appearing in his eyes. He opened the file on his desk and pulled out a copy of the property deed. You hold the primary deed. Aaron and his wife are legally classified as tenants at will. They possess no formal lease agreement. I can draft a standard 30-day notice to quit the premises today. Once the 30 days expire, we file for formal eviction in county court. The bailiffs will physically remove them in roughly 60 to 90 days. I shook my head slowly. 90 days is entirely unacceptable. 90 days provides him with an operational window to secure alternative housing, to hire a defense attorney, and to hide his assets. 90 days allows him to breathe. I need him suffocating by next week. Stephen leaned back in his leather chair, tapping his expensive silver pen against the glass. You want to bypass the eviction courts entirely? I want to liquidate the asset, I replied, my voice dropping to a hard, uncompromising register. I spent 40 years managing global corporate logistics. When a regional distribution center fails due to internal corruption, you do not spend 90 days slowly evicting the corrupt managers. You dissolve the entire entity. You liquidate the physical inventory, you sell the raw land, and you burn the lease. I do not want that suburban house back, Stephen. I do not want to manage it or rent it out. I want it sold. I want it sold out from under them while they are still sleeping in the master bedroom. Stephen stopped tapping the pen. A slow, sharp smile spread across his face. He understood precisely what I was engineering. You want to sell an occupied property? That is a notoriously difficult maneuver on the traditional real estate market. Standard buyers require walkthroughs, structural inspections, and empty, pristine rooms. They run from occupied homes, especially when the occupants are hostile family members facing eviction. Then we do not use the traditional market, I countered immediately. We use a corporate liquidator. Stephen nodded slowly, already accessing the necessary files in his mind. I have an established relationship with a private equity group called Apex Capital Holdings. They are a massive corporate entity that specializes in rapid cash acquisitions of distressed or heavily encumbered residential properties. They buy houses entirely sight unseen. They waive all inspections. They do not care about the current occupants because they employ an army of ruthless corporate litigators whose sole operational purpose is to execute rapid hostile evictions. They will buy the house with your son still sitting on the sofa, and they will have him thrown onto the street with zero hesitation. That is exactly the mechanism I require, I stated, feeling the adrenaline of the strategy sharpening my focus. What is the caveat? The caveat is the profit margin. Stephen explained, his tone returning to strict business. Apex Capital assumes a massive amount of legal risk and physical liability by purchasing an occupied home sight unseen. To offset that risk, they operate strictly below market value. Your property is currently appraised at roughly $850,000. Apex will offer you 80 cents on the dollar. You will take a severe financial hit. I performed the mental calculation instantly. 20% of $850,000 was $170,000. I would be walking away from nearly $200,000 of pure equity. For a fleeting second, the sheer volume of the lost capital registered in my mind, but I immediately pushed it aside. This was not a real estate transaction. It was a tactical military expenditure. I will accept a 20% loss, I said, without a single tremor in my voice. In fact, I want you to specifically offer them the property at that exact 20% discount right now. Do not negotiate. Do not attempt to counteroffer. Give them the absolute bottom floor price immediately. Stephen raised an eyebrow. You are deliberately hemorrhaging your own capital, Calvin. You are paying a premium for vengeance. I am paying a premium for velocity. I corrected him sharply. I know how corporate equity firms operate. If we try to negotiate a fair market price, the file goes to an underwriting committee. It takes 3 weeks to approve the funds. But if we hand them a pristine property in a wealthy suburb at a guaranteed 20% discount, the internal algorithms will automatically greenlight the acquisition. It becomes an irresistible asset transfer. If we give them that discount, what is the exact timeline for closing? Stephen pulled a pristine sheet of heavy bond paper from a drawer and laid it flat on the glass desk. If we offer the 20% discount today, they will bypass the underwriting committee entirely. They can wire the liquid funds and execute the clean title transfer in exactly 7 days. Next Monday. Next Monday. I repeated the words, tasting the absolute finality they carried. By next Monday, my son will no longer be living in a house owned by his father. He will be aggressively trespassing on private corporate property owned by a multi-billion-dollar investment firm. Stephen uncapped his silver pen. He swiftly wrote out a series of legal parameters on the blank document, drafting an exclusive rapid listing agreement right in front of me. He detailed the specific property coordinates, the exact discounted purchase price, and the guaranteed 7-day closing window. He spun the document around and slid it across the smooth glass surface toward me. He placed the heavy silver pen directly on top of the paper. Your son used your forged signature to steal $75,000. Stephen said, his voice incredibly quiet and deadly serious. Use your real signature to burn his world to the ground. I reached out and picked up the pen. The metal felt cold and heavy in my grip. I looked at the bottom of the document, at the single black line requiring my authorization. For 3 years, Aaron and Brooke had treated me as a silent, endless machine. They had mocked me, ignored me, and ultimately attempted to financially destroy me. They believed their actions carried absolutely zero consequences. I pressed the tip of the pen against the paper. I did not hesitate. I executed my signature with bold, sweeping strokes, legally binding the total liquidation of their entire manufactured reality. I placed the pen back on the desk. Stephen pulled the document back. He did not say a word. He simply turned to his scanner, digitized the binding contract, and transmitted it directly to the acquisition directors at Apex Capital Holdings. The digital transfer took less than 5 seconds. The mechanism was officially locked. The countdown had begun. Next Monday, the storm would finally break. The drive from the downtown financial district back to my quiet suburban neighborhood took exactly 47 minutes. I did not turn on the radio. I drove in total silence, letting the steady hum of the engine and the rhythm of the tires against the cold pavement anchor my thoughts. The meeting with Stephen had crystallized the abstract data into a tangible weapon. The exclusive listing agreement was signed and transmitted. The 30-day eviction notice was entirely bypassed. In exactly 7 days, an acquisition team from Apex Capital Holdings would legally own the property Aaron currently occupied. The digital guillotine had not merely dropped. It had severed the entire foundation of their stolen existence. I turned off the busy main thoroughfare and navigated the winding residential streets that led to my townhouse. The winter sky was a flat, unforgiving gray pressing down heavily on the bare trees and the frost-covered lawns. I felt a profound sense of operational calm. The frantic voicemails Aaron had left on my device earlier that morning had proven his total disorientation. He was a man entirely accustomed to manipulating his way out of minor inconveniences, but he possessed absolutely zero mental architecture to handle a total systemic collapse. He expected me to answer the phone and absorb his panic. He expected me to act like a compliant subordinate. My continued silence had clearly driven him to a point of physical desperation. As I rounded the final corner and approached my property, my operational calm instantly hardened into a state of absolute tactical alert. I slowed my vehicle to a crawl. The narrow concrete driveway leading to my attached garage was completely obstructed. A massive, gleaming, black luxury sports utility vehicle was parked aggressively across the apron of my driveway. It was not parked with any degree of spatial consideration. It was parked diagonally, with the rear tires crushing the frosted grass of my front lawn and the front bumper blocking the sidewalk. It was a deliberate, hostile territorial display. I recognized the vehicle immediately. It was the $80,000 flagship model Aaron had leased 18 months ago, claiming it was an absolute necessity for entertaining his high-end corporate clients. He had secured the exorbitant monthly payments for that specific vehicle using the exact same fraudulent financial leverage I had just finished dismantling. I brought my car to a complete halt, idling in the center of the quiet street. I kept the engine running and observed the scene unfolding on my property through the windshield. Aaron and Brooke were standing on my small concrete front porch. They were not waiting patiently like concerned family members, seeking a quiet resolution. They were pacing back and forth across the limited space like cornered volatile predators. The biting winter wind was visibly affecting them, but their sheer entitlement seemed to generate its own heat. Brooke was wrapped tightly in a thick designer winter coat, her arms crossed defensively over her chest. Her face was contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. She was aggressively tapping her expensive leather boot against the concrete, glaring at my locked front door, as if attempting to incinerate it with her sheer willpower. Aaron was in a state of continuous erratic motion. He was wearing a thin suit jacket, totally inappropriate for the freezing temperature, but he did not seem to notice the cold. He was holding his cellular phone to his ear, listening for a few seconds, before violently pulling it away and jabbing his thumb against the screen. He was attempting to call me again. He was standing on my property blocking my driveway and aggressively demanding that my cellular phone ring inside my empty house. I sat in the idling car and simply watched them. I evaluated their body language using the same detached metrics I would apply to a failing vendor on a loading dock. There was no remorse visible in their posture. There was no sorrow for the profound betrayal they had orchestrated. There was only the frantic, toxic rage of parasites suddenly deprived of their host. They had driven across the city not to apologize for forging my signature on federal bank documents, but to corner me in my own home and demand that I immediately restore their access to my stolen capital. They fundamentally believed that if they could physically confront me, they could bully, intimidate, and manipulate me back into submission. They still viewed me as a weak, isolated old man who could be easily broken. They had not yet comprehended that the father they knew had been entirely eradicated on a frozen porch weeks prior. They were currently trespassing on the territory of an adversary who had just sold their home to a private equity firm for a 20% loss simply to watch them suffer the velocity of the eviction. I took my foot off the brake pedal. I allowed my vehicle to slowly roll forward until the front bumper was mere inches from the polished black door of Aaron's aggressively parked luxury vehicle. The tires crunched loudly against the accumulated road salt and frozen gravel. The sound cut sharply through the quiet suburban air. Brooke noticed the vehicle first. She stopped her angry pacing and locked her eyes on my car. Her posture instantly transformed from defensive irritation to aggressive anticipation. She reached out and struck Aaron hard on the shoulder, pointing a manicured finger directly at my windshield. Aaron dropped his cellular phone from his ear. He spun around to face the street. His face was flushed red with the cold and the residual adrenaline of his uninhibited panic. For a fraction of a second, When his eyes met mine through the safety glass, I saw the raw, pathetic desperation vibrating beneath his expensive suit. I saw the terrifying realization that his entire fraudulent empire was rapidly burning to the ground. But that flicker of truth was instantly buried under a massive defensive wave of absolute blinding entitlement. His jaw clenched, his hands curled into tight, white-knuckled fists at his sides. The illusion of the successful corporate sun completely evaporated, revealing the volatile, desperate criminal underneath. He did not wave. He did not step aside to clear my driveway. He let out a visible shout of raw anger that puffed into the freezing air as a cloud of white vapor. He lunged off the elevated concrete porch, hitting the frosted grass with a heavy thud, and stepped aggressively toward my car. The engine of my vehicle fell silent, leaving only the sound of the harsh winter wind whipping across the frosted concrete of my driveway. I gripped the interior door handle and pushed it open, stepping out into the freezing air. I did not even have the opportunity to close my car door before the verbal assault began. Brooke closed the physical distance between us with alarming speed. Her face was flushed red against the gray morning, her perfectly manicured hands balled into tight, aggressive fists at her sides. She did not ask about my health. She did not offer a single word of polite greeting. She immediately launched into a shrill, piercing tirade, her voice completely devoid of any basic human decency. She screamed at me for intentionally sabotaging her morning. She detailed with agonizing entitlement how she had been standing at the checkout counter of an exclusive downtown boutique, surrounded by women in her elite social circle. She shrieked about the absolute indignity of handing the cashier her platinum emergency card, only to have the machine violently reject the transaction. She demanded to know how I could be so incredibly selfish and so utterly petty as to freeze my own credit line without consulting her first. I stood completely motionless beside my vehicle, resting my hands calmly on the cold metal of the roof. I observed her as one might observe a malfunctioning piece of machinery. Her breath plumed in the freezing air as she ranted about the profound social humiliation of having her purchases publicly declined. She genuinely believed that her temporary embarrassment at a high-end retail store was the ultimate tragedy of the morning. She had absolutely no concept that the card in her hand was fueled by stolen capital, or that the man standing beside her had committed a federal felony to maintain her opulent lifestyle. Aaron stepped forward physically, placing his hand on Brooke to pull her back. He could see that her shrill demands were bouncing completely harmlessly off my silent exterior. He tried to quickly recalibrate the dynamic, adopting the false authoritative posture he used when negotiating aggressive corporate sales. He adjusted the collar of his thin, expensive suit jacket, visibly shivering against the biting wind. He looked at me with a manufactured expression of extreme disappointment, shaking his head slowly, as if dealing with a senile, recalcitrant child. He informed me that my little clerical error with his banking application had caused a massive, highly inconvenient glitch. He claimed the bank had overreacted to a simple routing discrepancy and had placed an aggressive fraud alert on the home equity line. He demanded that I retrieve my cellular phone immediately. He ordered me to dial the fraud department while he stood there to verbally authorize the release of the funds and to formally apologize to the banking representatives for my irresponsible digital mistake. He actually attempted to convince me that the federal lockdown on his illegal loan was entirely my fault and a product of my elderly incompetence. I did not reach into my pocket for my phone. I simply stared at him, maintaining a flat, unwavering gaze. My continued silence visibly rattled him. The corporate facade began to aggressively crack, exposing the raw, unhinged panic mutating underneath. When he realized I was not going to blindly obey his verbal commands, Aaron reached inside his suit jacket. He pulled out a thick, leather-bound clipboard and practically shoved it across the hood of my car. A complex, densely worded legal document was clamped firmly to the board. He spoke rapidly, his words spilling over each other in his desperate haste. He told me that since I was apparently incapable of managing my own banking applications over the phone, he had proactively brought a solution. He claimed the document on the clipboard was a standard administrative release form. It was explicitly designed to clear the fraud alert. Unfreeze the $75,000 and permanently transfer the primary administrative control of the deed over to his name just to prevent any future misunderstandings. He was asking me to voluntarily sign away my home and legitimize his theft right there on the frozen concrete of my driveway. I looked down at the document, then back up at my son. Before I could utter a single word of rejection, Aaron snapped his fingers sharply toward his idling sports utility vehicle. The heavy passenger door of his luxury vehicle swung open. A man stepped out onto the driveway. He did not look like a corporate banking official or a respectable legal representative. He was wearing an ill-fitting, wrinkled overcoat. He was visibly sweating despite the freezing temperature, his eyes darting nervously up and down the quiet suburban street. He clutched a small, worn canvas bag tightly to his chest. Aaron introduced him with a dismissive wave of his hand. He stated that the man was a licensed mobile notary, a professional. He had paid a massive premium to bring directly to my property on a holiday week. Aaron patted the hood of my car aggressively, instructing me to place the clipboard down, sign the release authorization immediately, and allow his notary to officially stamp the paperwork. The sheer breathtaking audacity of the ambush settled heavily over the scene. Aaron had not merely come to argue. He had brought a completely compromised, corrupt notary to physically corner me on my own property. He intended to use the combined physical presence of 3 younger adults to intimidate, pressure, and actively coerce an elderly man into signing a fraudulent legal instrument. The notary shuffled forward, his boots dragging heavily against the frost. He refused to make direct eye contact with me. He pulled a heavy brass ink stamp from his canvas bag, his hands shaking slightly as he unscrewed the cap. He was clearly a man who operated entirely in the shadows, someone Aaron had likely sourced through the same shady network he used to secure his rapid cash loans. "Sign it, Calvin," Aaron demanded, entirely abandoning the pretense of calling me Dad. His voice was a harsh, desperate bark. "Sign the document right now. You are not going to ruin my life over a technicality. You are going to sign the release and we are going to walk away from this, or I swear to God I will have you declared legally incompetent and take the estate anyway." The threat hung violently in the freezing air. He had finally revealed the absolute depths of his depravity. He was actively threatening to strip me of my mental autonomy and to lock me away in a facility simply to maintain his access to my capital. I looked at Brooke, whose arms were still crossed, her eyes glaring with toxic entitlement. I looked at the sweating, terrified notary holding the brass stamp, and finally I looked directly into the bloodshot, panicked eyes of the man I had raised. They were fully expecting me to crumble. They were waiting for the elderly father to surrender to the sheer, overwhelming pressure of the physical confrontation. They anticipated fear, confusion, or a desperate pleading for familial reconciliation. I did not give them anything they expected. I stood perfectly upright, entirely immune to the freezing wind and the hostile intimidation. I reached out and placed my bare hand firmly on the edge of the leather clipboard. I did not pull a pen from my pocket. I simply shifted my gaze to the shivering, corrupt notary. "If you place that stamp on a single piece of paper on my property," I said, my voice cutting through the ambient noise of the street like a surgical blade, "I will personally ensure you spend the next 10 years in a federal penitentiary for participating in an active wire fraud conspiracy." The notary physically recoiled instantly, dropping the heavy brass stamp back into his canvas bag. He took 3 rapid, staggering steps backward, violently shaking his head in total retreat. Aaron lunged forward, slamming his hands furiously against the hood of my vehicle. He opened his mouth to unleash another desperate wave of threats, completely unaware that his intimidation tactics were entirely useless against a man who had already initiated the total liquidation of his world. Aaron stopped his aggressive advance the very second he processed the absolute failure of his physical intimidation. He stood on the frosted concrete of the driveway, breathing heavily, his chest heaving under his thin suit jacket. He looked down the empty street at the taillights of the retreating notary, and then turned his gaze back to me. I watched the frantic gears turning behind his eyes. The brute force strategy had evaporated, leaving him completely exposed. I observed a terrifying physical transformation take place right in front of me. The violent red flush drained from his face. The aggressive, rigid posture of his shoulders completely relaxed. He took a slow, deep breath and let it out into the freezing air. When he looked at me again, the panicked criminal was gone, entirely replaced by a sickeningly sweet, deeply concerned son. "Dad, you are clearly not well." Aaron spoke, his voice dropping an entire octave into a soft, patronizing register. "You are confused. You are making completely irrational decisions, and it is starting to become dangerous." He took a slow, cautious step toward me, holding his hands up with his palms open, as if he were trying to pacify a frightened animal. He began to completely rewrite the reality of the past 48 hours, right there on the frozen driveway. He told me that my memory was obviously slipping. He suggested, with a voice dripping with manufactured pity, that I had simply forgotten to pay the monthly bills. He stated that the frozen credit card at the boutique and the failed mortgage transfer were not deliberate tactical actions, but the tragic mistakes of a severely declining mind. He claimed I had logged into my banking portals and hopelessly scrambled the routing numbers in a state of deep cognitive confusion. Brooke instantly recognized the tactical shift and seamlessly fell into step beside him. She wrapped her expensive designer coat tighter around her waist and looked at me with an expression of profound, exaggerated sorrow. "Calvin, it was so terribly embarrassing for you," she murmured, her voice trembling with fake empathy. "The cashier at the boutique was so worried when the card declined. She asked if you were suffering from dementia. She asked if you had forgotten how to manage your own accounts. We are just so incredibly worried about you, Calvin. You are acting so erratically. You are destroying your own life because your mind is failing." I stood perfectly still beside my vehicle, resting my hands on the cold roof. I did not blink. I did not defend my cognitive abilities or argue against their completely fabricated narrative. I simply observed the sheer, breathtaking audacity of their psychological assault. They were standing on the concrete of a property I had purchased, demanding access to capital I had earned, and actively attempting to convince me that my self-defense was a symptom of a degenerative brain disease. I observed the precise way Aaron held the clipboard. His knuckles were white. The paper fluttered slightly in the harsh winter wind. He was attempting to execute a psychological hostile takeover. He wanted me to believe that my reality was entirely fractured. He needed me to doubt the fundamental architecture of my own mind. It was a classic corporate gaslighting maneuver designed to destabilize a target before forcing a signature on a binding contract. Aaron stepped closer, tapping his fingers gently against the leather clipboard he had previously tried to force upon me. He did not mention the fraudulent equity line. He completely ignored the federal wire fraud I had just accused him of committing. He looked down at the dense legal document and then back up into my eyes with a look of extreme sorrowful burden. "I brought this paperwork to help you, Dad," Aaron said, his tone heavily laced with sacrificial duty. "It is not an administrative release. It is a comprehensive, durable power of attorney. It gives me full medical and financial proxy over your estate. It is strictly for your own good. You are clearly struggling to manage your daily existence. You are forgetting to execute basic financial transfers. You are alienating the only family you have left. I need you to sign this document today so I can take the heavy burden off your shoulders. Let me step in and manage the accounts before you accidentally bankrupt yourself in a state of severe confusion." He held the clipboard out toward me, offering it as if it were a life preserver. He was asking me to voluntarily hand over the absolute legal control of my entire existence. He wanted the legal authority to drain my retirement accounts, to leverage my townhouse, and to completely strip my assets under the impenetrable protection of a state-sanctioned power of attorney. When I did not reach out to take the clipboard, the sickeningly sweet facade began to harden at the extreme edges. The manufactured concern in his eyes crystallized into a cold, absolute menace. He lowered the clipboard slightly and leaned his face closer to mine, his breath washing over me in the freezing winter air. "Dad, I am trying to do this the easy way, Aaron whispered, the patronizing tone dropping into a flat, merciless threat. I am trying to protect your dignity. But if you refuse to sign this document right now, you will leave me absolutely no choice. I will have to call Adult Protective Services. I will tell the state investigators that my elderly father is suffering from severe delusions and poses an active, immediate danger to himself. I will show them the canceled accounts, the frozen credit lines, and the paranoid security measures you have initiated. I will easily find a doctor willing to testify to your immediate cognitive decline. Brooke nodded slowly, stepping up beside her husband. We will have to do it, Calvin, she added, her voice devoid of any remaining warmth. It will break our hearts, but we will have the state declare you legally incompetent. Aaron kept his eyes locked on mine, pressing the psychological blade deeper. Do you have any idea what happens when the state takes over, Dad? He asked, his voice utterly ruthless. They do not let you stay in this comfortable townhouse. They strip you of your independence entirely. They will place you in a state-run nursing facility. You will be locked in a sterile room on a secure ward. Strangers will manage your schedule, they will feed you your meals, and they will sedate you when you become agitated. Your entire estate will be liquidated by a court-appointed guardian to pay for your confinement. You will lose absolutely everything. You will die alone in a hospital bed with no control over a single aspect of your reality. He paused, letting the horrific, vivid imagery settle over the frozen driveway. He believed he had perfectly engineered my ultimate nightmare. He believed he had weaponized the deepest fear of every aging parent and pointed it directly at my chest. Sign the proxy, Dad, Aaron commanded, his voice returning to a sharp, authoritative bark. Sign the document right now. Let me take control of the banking, and I will let you stay in your house. I will let you keep your quiet little life. Fight me on this, and I swear to you, I will have you committed by the end of the week. I stood in the profound silence of the freezing morning. A normal father would have been completely crushed by the overwhelming weight of their psychological abuse. A normal father would have felt a deep, paralyzing terror at the threat of losing his autonomy and dying in a locked psychiatric ward. He would have questioned his own memory. He would have wondered if he had truly made a mistake. He would have reached out with a trembling hand to take the pen and sign away his life simply to keep the terrifying illusion of his family intact. I did not feel terror. I felt a cold, absolute confirmation of my adversary total moral bankruptcy. They had abandoned any pretense of familial loyalty. They were hostile entities actively threatening my liberty and my physical survival to secure their ongoing financial extraction. They had played their final desperate card, hoping the threat of institutionalization would force my immediate surrender. They had no idea that they were threatening a man who had already initiated a sequence of events that would leave them entirely homeless and facing a brutal eviction before the month was over. Aaron stood with his chest heaving, his breath pluming in the freezing winter air. His threat to have me permanently committed to a locked psychiatric ward hung between us like a physical object. He waited for the terror to register in my eyes. He waited for me to crumble, to beg for my autonomy, and to surrender to his extortion simply to keep my freedom. Brooke stepped closer to him, her face a mask of toxic anticipation, waiting for my absolute defeat. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I did not offer them the satisfaction of a defensive argument or a desperate plea. I simply looked at the two of them with the profound, absolute detachment of a man observing a parasitic infection that he had already cured. The sheer silence of my reaction began to unnervingly echo across the frosted driveway, completely neutralizing their aggressive momentum. Before I addressed my son, I slowly shifted my gaze to his wife. Brooke instinctively stiffened under my clinical observation. I looked at her not as a family member, but as an itemized ledger of stolen capital. I audited her physical presence with absolute ruthless precision. I looked at her expensive winter coat. I recognized the specific Italian designer label sewn into the collar. It was a recent seasonal release heavily promoted in luxury catalogs. I knew precisely what it cost. I lowered my eyes to her boots. They were imported calfskin leather with distinctive gold hardware shining dully in the gray morning light. I looked at the heavy luxury handbag slung over her shoulder. I performed the mental arithmetic instantly, my voice breaking the heavy silence with a flat, mechanical precision. Your winter coat retails for $2,400. I stated my words clipping clearly through the bitter wind. Your leather boots cost $850. The handbag you are currently clutching is a limited production model that sells for approximately $4,200. You are standing on my concrete driveway wearing nearly $7,500 worth of retail garments. You purchased these exact items during the holiday weekend using a joint platinum emergency card. Brooke opened her mouth to speak, a flush of indignant rage creeping up her neck, but I did not allow her a single syllable of interruption. That specific credit line is directly tethered to my personal retirement reserves. I continued, my voice remaining entirely devoid of emotion. You did not earn that money, Brooke. You did not generate that capital. You extracted it from my accounts under the arrogant assumption that I was too elderly and too mentally compromised to monitor my own financial architecture. You believed you could siphon my resources indefinitely to fund a lifestyle you could not legitimately afford. You are currently humiliated because that plastic card was declined at a boutique, but you possess absolutely no shame regarding the fact that you are actively wearing my stolen retirement. Brooke physically stepped back as if she had been violently struck. Her mouth snapped shut. The manufactured empathy she had previously displayed evaporated instantly, replaced by a deep, humiliated shock. She looked at Aaron for defense, but Aaron was entirely paralyzed by the surgical precision of my audit. He could not protect her from the undeniable mathematical truth of their parasitism. I turned my attention back to the man I had raised. Aaron was staring at me, his jaw tight, his eyes wide with a creeping, inescapable dread. The patronizing corporate son was completely gone. The aggressive bully who had threatened me with a nursing home had evaporated. He was finally beginning to understand that he had walked blindly into a meticulously engineered trap. He had brought threats to a man who had already executed a total systemic demolition. I reached a hand inside the deep breast pocket of my heavy wool overcoat. I did not rush the movement. I slowly pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope. The paper was crisp and rigid in the freezing temperature. I held the envelope out toward him, suspending it over the hood of my idling vehicle. Aaron stared at the envelope as if it were a venomous serpent. He did not want to take it. His survival instincts were screaming at him to turn around, get back into his expensive leased vehicle, and drive away. But his sheer desperate need for control forced his hand. He needed to know what data I possessed. His fingers were trembling visibly as he reached out and took the envelope from my grasp. "Open it," I commanded softly. Aaron fumbled with the metal clasp. His hands were shaking so violently that he nearly dropped the heavy packet onto the frosted concrete. He finally tore the flap open and pulled out a thick stack of stapled legal documents. He flipped to the very first page. I watched his eyes scan the bold black lettering at the top of the sheet. It was the formal fraud alert generated by the regional credit union. It was not a simple notification of a banking error. It was a severe, legally binding declaration that the $75,000 home equity line of credit had been permanently frozen due to verifiable documented forgery. It explicitly stated that the electronic signature did not match the physical records and that the Federal Fraud Division had been formally notified of the discrepancy. Aaron's face turned a sickly pale gray. The blood completely drained from his cheeks, leaving him looking hollow and entirely terrified. His lips parted, but no sound emerged. He realized in that exact second that his crime was not a secret. It was a documented, verifiable fact sitting on a federal banking server. He swallowed hard, his Adam apple bobbing visibly in his throat. A bead of cold sweat formed on his brow, despite the freezing wind. "Turn to the next document," I instructed, my voice entirely flat. He mechanically folded the fraud alert back, exposing the second set of papers. It was the comprehensive binding contract of sale from Apex Capital Holdings. It detailed the exact coordinates of the suburban property he currently occupied. It listed the aggressive discounted purchase price, and it clearly displayed my authorized physical signature executing the total liquidation of the asset. Aaron let out a shallow, ragged gasp. He read the corporate title of the investment firm. He read the aggressive 7-day closing timeline. His hands began to shake with such velocity that the thick pages rattled loudly against the frozen air. He looked up at me, his eyes wide and completely devoid of their previous arrogance. "You sold the house." He whispered the words barely escaping his throat. "You sold the house to a corporate liquidator." "I sold a liability to an asset management firm." I corrected him clinically. "They specialize in hostile rapid cash acquisitions. They do not care that you currently reside in the master bedroom. They do not care about your affluent neighbors or your country club status. They only care about the physical land and the structure sitting upon it. You do not own that property, Aaron. You never owned that property. You were merely a tenant utilizing my charity, and you completely exhausted that charity the exact second you forged my signature on a federal banking application." "Read the final page," I said. Aaron slowly flipped to the last document in the stack. It was a formal 30-day notice to vacate the premises drafted by Stephen Porter and legally bound to the acquisition contract. It explicitly stated that his status as a tenant at will was officially terminated. It required him to remove his personal belongings and permanently vacate the property or face an aggressive corporate eviction executed by the new legal owners. The physical manifestation of his defeat was absolute. Aaron's knees visibly buckled. He leaned heavily against the side of his luxury sports utility vehicle, using the cold metal to keep himself upright. The arrogant corporate predator who had arrived at my home ready to freeze me into a psychiatric ward was completely gone. He was nothing but a broken, bankrupt man staring at the concrete evidence of his total systemic destruction. Brooke leaned over his shoulder, reading the documents clutched in his trembling hands. A sharp, strangled cry escaped her lips. The opulent lifestyle she had demanded, the wealthy suburban illusion she had carefully maintained, was instantly and completely vaporized. They were losing their home, their credit lines, and their entire social standing in a single devastating stroke. They had built a castle on a foundation of stolen money, and I had just detonated the bedrock. I did not feel a single trace of pity. I had audited the failure, and I had executed the necessary liquidation. I looked directly into my son's bloodshot, terrified eyes. He was hyperventilating, his breath coming in short, rapid gasps. The reality of his absolute ruin was crashing down upon him, crushing the breath from his lungs. I delivered the final necessary parameters of his new reality. I did not raise my voice. I did not inject a single trace of malice or triumph into my tone. I spoke with the irreversible weight of a judge reading a permanent sentence. "You are going to pack your things quietly," I said, maintaining a cold, unbreakable eye contact that pinned him to the vehicle. "Or the next document I hand over will be your federal indictment for forgery." I did not wait for his acknowledgement. I did not wait for Brooke to start sobbing into the collar of her stolen coat. I simply turned my back on them, walked to my front door, and unlocked it. I stepped inside the quiet sanctuary of my townhouse and shut the heavy door permanently, severing the connection to the parasites, bleeding out on the driveway. The heavy oak door closed with a solid mechanical click, entirely severing the freezing air and the frantic gasping of the two parasites left on my driveway. I engaged the brass deadbolt with a smooth, silent motion. I did not walk away into the depths of my townhouse to seek comfort or distance. I stood perfectly still in the shadowed foyer and observed the resulting fallout through the narrow vertical glass panels flanking the entrance. I became a silent witness to the total collapse of their manufactured reality. Brooke shattered the momentary silence. Her voice penetrated the thick, insulated glass, not as words, but as a raw, feral shriek of absolute cornered desperation. She threw her heavy leather designer handbag onto the frosted concrete, where it scraped against the ice. She began pacing back and forth across the driveway with the frantic, erratic energy of a trapped animal. She screamed toward my house, her face distorted into a mask, of pure, unadulterated venom. She swore she would destroy me. She shrieked that she would hire the most ruthless corporate litigators in the entire state to completely bankrupt my estate and drag my name through the mud. She promised to ruin my reputation among my former professional peers and strip me of every single asset I had ever hoarded. I watched her flail in the freezing wind, completely detached from her performance. She was completely unhinged and entirely incapable of processing the mathematical reality that she possessed absolutely no leverage. She had no capital to hire expensive litigators. Her credit lines were permanently frozen. Her assets were effectively seized, and her husband was staring directly at a federal felony indictment. She was screaming into a dark void, refusing to accept that the void had already swallowed her whole. Her threats were nothing more than the dying spasms of a parasite severed from its host. Aaron did not attempt to calm his wife. He did not look at the scattered legal documents resting on the hood of his leased luxury vehicle. The absolute terror that had previously filled his eyes had mutated into a cold, rigid panic. It was the specific type of panic that drives a drowning man to push his rescuer under the water simply to secure one final breath of air. He realized his physical intimidation had failed completely. He realized his pathetic attempts at psychological gaslighting had failed. He realized the undeniable proof of his legal forgery had trapped him in a corner with absolutely zero avenues of escape. He needed a nuclear option. He needed an immediate, overpowering external force to break my defenses before the corporate liquidators arrived next week to physically throw him onto the street. I watched through this cold glass as Aaron reached deep into his suit jacket and pulled out his cellular phone. His fingers were trembling so violently he nearly dropped the expensive device onto the frozen driveway. He did not dial a criminal defense attorney to mitigate his exposure. He did not call his bank to attempt a desperate negotiation. He pressed 3 specific digits and raised the phone to his ear. He paced aggressively toward my front porch, his eyes locked entirely on the heavy oak door separating us. I could hear his voice bleeding through the glass structure. He was not speaking in the panicked, desperate tone of a ruined corporate criminal. He instantly manufactured a voice of sheer hysterical terror. He was crying. He forced actual tears into his vocal cords, pleading desperately with the emergency dispatcher on the other end of the line. He screamed that he needed immediate police and medical assistance at my specific address. He stated his full name and my exact location with frantic, manufactured urgency. He began to weave a masterclass of weaponized fiction directly to the civil authorities. He cried into the receiver, claiming that his elderly father was experiencing a violent, catastrophic dementia episode. He lied with the smooth, practiced ease of a career sociopath who had spent years manipulating reality to suit his needs. He told the dispatcher that I had completely lost touch with reality and was suffering from severe aggressive hallucinations. He shrieked that I had barricaded myself inside the townhouse, that I had disabled the internal security system, and that I was actively threatening to physically harm myself and anyone who attempted to intervene. He painted a vivid, terrifying picture of a deeply disturbed geriatric patient suffering from severe paranoid delusions. He claimed I was shouting incoherently about corporate conspiracies and stolen bank funds. He begged the authorities to hurry, stating that he was absolutely terrified I would set the townhouse on fire or attempt a violent physical assault if they did not arrive immediately to forcibly detain me. Brooke instantly recognized his tactical shift. She stopped her hysterical shrieking and moved perfectly into his manufactured narrative. She grabbed Aaron by the arm and began sobbing loudly toward the phone, intentionally allowing her dramatic wailing to be recorded by the emergency dispatch center. She wailed that she was terrified for my life, begging the imaginary operator to send an ambulance to sedate me before I did something tragic and irreversible. They were weaponizing the state against me. They were attempting to use the local police and the medical establishment as their personal enforcement mechanism. Aaron calculated that if he could convince the authorities I was a violent, schizophrenic danger to myself, they would breach my front door, strap me to a medical gurney, and force me into an involuntary psychiatric hold. Once I was detained in a hospital under a mandatory 72-hour evaluation period, He would have the necessary operational window to file his fraudulent power of attorney, bypass the property sale, and drain my remaining liquid assets before anyone realized he was the actual criminal. It was the ultimate escalation in his conflict chain. He was leveraging my advanced age and societal biases entirely against me. He believed the arriving authorities would instinctively trust a well-dressed, highly distressed corporate son over a silent elderly man locked inside a dark house. I did not panic. I did not run to my kitchen to frantically gather my legal documents or prepare an anxious defense. I simply stood in the quiet shadows of my foyer, maintaining my absolute operational calm. I watched Aaron pace across the frosted lawn, continuing his Oscar-worthy performance for the dispatcher. He was constantly checking his expensive watch, calculating the exact response time of the local police precinct. I knew exactly what would happen when the authorities arrived. I knew they would approach the house expecting chaos, violence, and severe mental decay. They would find absolutely nothing but a perfectly calm, perfectly lucid retired executive holding undeniable documented proof of federal wire fraud committed by the weeping man standing on the driveway. Aaron was not summoning a medical rescue team to save his lifestyle. He was actively summoning his own arresting officers to the scene of his crime. The bitter winter wind continued to whip across the desolate suburban street, carrying the heavy scent of impending absolute ruin. I stood behind the glass, my breathing slow and perfectly measured. Then I heard it. It started as a faint, high-pitched wail, cutting sharply through the gray, frozen morning. It grew steadily louder, multiplying and echoing against the surrounding houses as multiple emergency vehicles accelerated down the main boulevard toward my location. The flashing red and blue lights began to reflect weakly against the frost-covered trees at the end of the block. Aaron lowered his cellular phone, staring at my front door with a look of absolute toxic triumph. He genuinely believed he had won. He believed the approaching sirens were the sound of his salvation. I remained perfectly still in the shadows, waiting for the flashing lights to illuminate the final total destruction of my son. The flashing red and blue lights cut violently through the gray winter morning, reflecting off the frost-covered glass of my front windows. I stood perfectly still in the shadows of the foyer, watching the street. Two heavy police cruisers came to a halt, blocking the flow of traffic entirely. A dull gray sedan parked directly behind them. 4 uniformed officers stepped out onto the frozen asphalt, resting their hands casually on their heavy utility belts. A woman emerged from the gray sedan. She wore a sensible dark winter coat and carried a thick plastic clipboard. She moved with the tired, cautious efficiency of a state investigator. I knew exactly who she was. Diane Silva, from Adult Protective Services. Aaron did not wait for them to approach the property. He practically threw himself across the frozen lawn to intercept them. I watched him completely abandon the rigid, panicked posture he had displayed just moments ago. He executed a flawless, terrifying physical transformation. His shoulders slumped heavily. He buried his face in his hands, allowing his body to tremble with manufactured grief. When he lowered his hands, his eyes were red and wet. He let out a loud, choked sob that carried clearly through the cold air. It was an absolute masterclass in sociopathic manipulation. "Officer, please, you have to help us," Aaron cried, his voice cracking with artificial desperation. "My father is inside. He has completely lost his mind." The officers exchanged a quick, tactical glance while Diane Silva stepped forward, clicking her pen. She asked Aaron to explain the situation calmly. Aaron painted a vivid, horrifying portrait of a sudden catastrophic mental collapse. He told the investigator that he had come to check on me because I had been missing appointments and acting strangely all week. He cried that when he arrived I was completely unrecognizable. He claimed I was suffering from severe rapid onset dementia and violent paranoid delusions. "He thinks everyone is trying to rob him," Aaron sobbed, wiping a fake tear from his frozen cheek. "He is hallucinating about stolen money and federal bank fraud. He is shouting about corporate conspiracies and forged signatures." We tried to calm him down, but he became incredibly aggressive. He threatened to attack my wife. He locked himself inside the house and disabled the security system. I am terrified he is going to hurt himself or accidentally set the property on fire. Please, you have to commit him. You have to get him to a secure hospital right now." Brooke seamlessly integrated herself into the performance. She stepped up beside Aaron, wrapping her arms around his waist and burying her face in his shoulder. She trembled violently, playing the role of the traumatized daughter-in-law. She whimpered softly, telling Diane Silva that I had lunged at her through the doorway when she simply tried to hand me a cup of coffee. She claimed my eyes were entirely vacant and that I did not even know my own name. I observed their synchronized theater from the silence of my dark foyer. I felt a cold, clinical appreciation for the sheer depth of their depravity. They were not merely lying. They were expertly weaponizing the state's established protocols for elderly care directly against me. They knew that the authorities arrived at these situations entirely primed to expect cognitive decay. They were feeding Diane Silva every single necessary buzzword to trigger an involuntary psychiatric hold. Paranoia, hallucinations, aggressive behavior, imminent danger to self and others. Aaron knew that if the police believed his narrative, they would not knock politely. They would breach the heavy oak door. They would restrain me, force me onto a medical gurney, and transport me to a locked psychiatric ward for a mandatory 72-hour evaluation. That 3-day operational window was all Aaron needed. Once I was legally sedated and confined, he would immediately file his fraudulent power of attorney and drain every single liquid asset I possessed before the acquisition firm could finalize the eviction. He was using the police as his personal extraction team. Diane Silva nodded sympathetically, listening to Aaron weep. She made several quick notes on her clipboard. She turned to the 4 uniformed officers and gestured toward my townhouse. Their postures instantly shifted from casual observation to tactical readiness. They unclipped their heavy flashlights and began walking up my concrete driveway, their boots crunching loudly against the frozen gravel. Aaron watched them approach my door. He placed a comforting arm around Brooke, but I could see the cold, absolute triumph radiating from his posture. He genuinely believed his masterstroke had succeeded. He believed the authorities were about to eliminate his problem entirely. The officers stepped onto my front porch. They stood directly on the other side of the heavy oak door, expecting to find a raving, filthy old man lost in a violent hallucination. They expected screaming and chaos. I did not retreat into the house. I did not hide. I smoothed the lapels of my wool overcoat and took a slow, measured breath. I reached out and rested my hand on the cold, brass deadbolt, preparing to shatter their entire manufactured reality. I did not wait for the heavy knock to echo through my home. I turned the brass deadbolt and pulled the oak door open just as the investigator raised her fist to strike the wood. She froze instantly on the frosted concrete. The 4 uniformed police officers standing on my walkway behind her instinctively shifted their weight toward their heavy utility belts. They were entirely braced for a violent physical confrontation with a deranged elderly man. I did not give them a single reason to escalate their tactical posture. I stood in the doorway, wearing my tailored wool trousers and a perfectly pressed dress shirt. I looked at the lead investigator with a mild, polite expression. I smiled gently and told her that it was far too cold to be standing outside on the freezing concrete. I invited her to come inside the warm house and offered to brew a fresh pot of chamomile tea. The investigator lowered her hand. Her eyes darted rapidly across my face and my clothing, searching for the severe cognitive decay my son had just hysterically described on the driveway. She fully expected to find a disheveled, confused man, lost in a violent, paranoid hallucination. Instead, she found a calm, retired corporate logistics executive holding the door open with steady, unblemished hospitality. She looked back over her shoulder at Aaron. My son was still standing near his luxury vehicle, clutching his wife and waiting for the police to drag me out in heavy medical restraints. The investigator turned back to me and nodded slowly. She instructed the 4 police officers to remain outside on the front porch. She stepped over the threshold and walked into my quiet foyer. I led her directly into my formal dining room. I did not rush my movements. I walked with the deliberate, measured pace of a man who is entirely in control of his physical and mental environment. I gestured toward one of the heavy mahogany chairs at the table. I walked into the adjacent kitchen and poured 2 cups of hot water from the kettle I had boiled earlier that morning, anticipating this exact sequence of events. I placed a ceramic cup in front of her and sat down on the opposite side of the table. She did not touch the warm tea. She unclipped her pen from her plastic clipboard and looked at me with a mixture of professional caution and deep confusion. She stated that her name was Diane Silva. She explained that she was legally obligated to investigate a priority report regarding my immediate mental deterioration and my potential threat to public safety. I maintained unbroken eye contact with her. I told her I completely understood her position and deeply respected her professional duty. I explained that my son Aaron had likely told her a very compelling and highly emotional story regarding my sudden tragic loss of sanity. I told her that he probably mentioned severe delusions regarding stolen money and forged banking documents. Diane nodded slowly, her eyes narrowing as she tried to reconcile the hysterical, sobbing son outside with the perfectly articulate father sitting quietly in front of her. I reached under the polished surface of the mahogany table. I retrieved a thick, heavy leather-bound binder and placed it gently next to her teacup. I did not launch into an emotional defense of my character. I did not complain about my son betraying my trust or breaking my heart. I simply pushed the leather binder toward her and instructed her to open it. Diane flipped the heavy cover back. The very first document inside was not a financial ledger or a property deed. It was a comprehensive 20-page psychiatric evaluation. It was printed on the official watermarked letterhead of the most prestigious cognitive behavioral clinic in the state. The medical evaluation was incredibly thorough, detailing rigorous memory tests, cognitive retention exams, and complex psychological profiling. The final page bore the signature of the chief medical director, officially certifying that my mental acuity was absolutely flawless, and that I possessed the complete uncompromised capacity to manage my own financial and legal affairs. Diane looked closely at the date stamped at the top of the medical evaluation. She looked up at me, her expression shifting from cautious confusion to absolute, profound realization. I took a slow sip of my tea. I told her that I had proactively scheduled and completed that extensive psychiatric evaluation exactly 3 days ago. I explained that earlier this week I had discreetly audited our shared family server. I had discovered digital search records showing Aaron actively researching local attorneys who specialized in involuntary guardianship and emergency power of attorney petitions. I knew the exact moment I froze his fraudulent credit lines, he would retaliate by attempting to weaponize the state against my autonomy. I told Diane I knew he would try to use my advanced age as a weapon to execute a hostile legal takeover of my entire estate. I had simply secured the undeniable medical armor required to deflect his inevitable psychological attack long before he even possessed the courage to dial the emergency dispatch center. Diane Silva closed the leather binder. The soft, heavy click of the cover echoed loudly in the quiet dining room. She did not ask me another question regarding my mental health. She did not ask me to perform a basic memory test or state the current calendar date. The 20 pages of unassailable medical documentation had completely obliterated Aaron and his fictional narrative. Diane looked toward the front window, where the flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers were still reflecting off the glass. She realized in that exact moment that she had been expertly manipulated. She realized that the hysterical weeping man standing on the frozen driveway was not a desperate son trying to save his father. He was a cornered, aggressive predator trying to use her legal authority to cover up a massive financial crime. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the smooth mahogany table. I told her there were several other critical documents behind the psychiatric evaluation that she needed to review immediately. I informed her that the binder contained the verified proof of the forged $75,000 home equity line of credit. I told her it contained the digital timestamps proving Aaron had illegally routed the stolen funds directly into his private banking accounts. I explained that it also contained the executed contract of sale for his current residence and the immediate termination of his lease. I offered her the complete, unvarnished truth of his sprawling criminality, wrapped neatly in a single leather binder. I asked her to please invite the 4 police officers into my dining room so we could formally discuss the immediate arrest of the man currently trespassing on my driveway. Diane slowly turned the heavy parchment page of the psychiatric evaluation. She did not speak. The silence in the formal dining room was absolute, broken only by the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. I watched her eyes track across the subsequent documents I had meticulously organized within the leather binder. Her professionally neutral expression began to fracture as she processed the raw, undeniable data. I reached across the polished mahogany table and gently tapped the corner of a bank statement highlighted in a sharp fluorescent yellow. I explained that the document detailed the exact routing numbers of the fraudulent $75,000 home equity line of credit. I watched her trace the flow of capital with the tip of her pen. The funds did not rest in any account associated with my name. They were instantly wired into a private wealth management portfolio, independently controlled by my son and his wife. I then guided her attention to the final section of the binder. I explained that when I initially discovered the unauthorized credit inquiry, I did not simply freeze the account. I contacted the regional fraud division of the credit union and requested the specific digital footprint of the application. I slid a rigid piece of paper toward her, detailing a string of complex numerical values. I told Diane that the electronic signature executing the loan was generated from a specific Internet protocol address. I watched her read the physical geographic location tethered to that digital address. It did not originate from my secure home network. The digital fingerprint mapped flawlessly to the exact residential coordinates of the suburban property Aaron currently occupied. It was a perfect, undeniable digital confession of federal wire fraud executed from his own living room. The narrative inside the dining room flipped in a single breathtaking instant. Diane Silva stopped reading. She sat back in the heavy mahogany chair, and the weary, sympathetic posture of a social worker evaporated completely. A cold, terrifying, predatory sharpness took its place. She was no longer looking at a vulnerable elderly victim, suffering from severe cognitive decay. She was staring directly at a textbook prosecution for felony-level elder financial exploitation. The tragic illusion of a son desperate to save his declining father shattered into 1,000 pieces. Diane realized the sheer breathtaking audacity of the man currently weeping on my driveway. Her jaw tightened as the profound insult to her profession crystallized in her mind. Aaron had intentionally summoned her here. He had actively attempted to weaponize her agency to execute a hostile psychological assault. He had tried to use her legal authority as a blunt instrument to lock a perfectly sane man inside a psychiatric ward simply to secure an operational window to finalize his theft. He believed she was stupid enough to process his manufactured tears without requiring a single piece of verifiable medical evidence. He believed he could use the state to bury his crime. Diane stood up from the table. She did not take a sip of the chamomile tea. She closed the leather binder and pulled it tightly against her chest, claiming it as official state evidence. She looked down at me with an expression of profound, absolute professional respect. She told me that she had investigated hundreds of cases involving entitled family members attempting to strip assets from their aging parents. She stated that she had seen every manipulation and every lie ever conceived by a greedy child. But she admitted in a low, steady voice that she had never witnessed a predator walk so blindly and so arrogantly into his own perfectly engineered execution. She turned away from the table and walked down the hallway toward the foyer. The 4 uniformed police officers were still standing on the frozen concrete of the front porch, their bodies tense, their hands resting near their heavy utility belts. They were entirely prepared to breach the house and physically restrain a violent, delusional patient. Diane reached out and pulled the heavy oak door open. The freezing winter wind washed over the threshold, sweeping into the warm house. Aaron looked up instantly. His face was still wet with manufactured tears, his shoulders still slumped in an attitude of tragic defeat. He expected to see me dragged out in heavy medical restraints. He expected Diane to offer him a sympathetic nod, confirming that his father was finally secure and that his financial future was fully protected. Diane Silva stepped out onto the porch alone. She did not look at Aaron with sympathy. She looked at him with the cold, merciless gaze of a hunter who had just cornered her prey. She turned to the lead police officer and pointed a single rigid finger directly at my son. She instructed the officers to detain Aaron immediately for suspected felony elder financial abuse and federal wire fraud. Diane Silva stepped out onto the frozen concrete of the front porch and let the heavy oak door click shut behind her. Aaron immediately stopped his manufactured sobbing. He stood up straight, wiping his eyes, expecting her to deliver the exact legal mandate he needed to authorize his theft. He waited for her to instruct the police officers to breach the house and extract his father. Diane did not look at him with sympathy. She looked at him with the cold, clinical disgust of a professional who had just uncovered a massive felony. She walked down the short flight of stairs and stopped directly in front of him. "Your father is in perfect physical and mental health," Diane stated, her voice completely devoid of warmth. "He is entirely competent to manage his own legal and financial affairs. I have just reviewed a comprehensive 20-page psychiatric evaluation executed 3 days ago by a board-certified medical director." Aaron opened his mouth to protest, to claim the evaluation was fake, but Diane raised a single rigid hand and silenced him instantly. "I also reviewed the verified bank logs and the Internet Protocol timestamps regarding a $75,000 home equity line of credit," Diane continued, her words hitting him like physical blows. "Adult Protective Services is formally opening a criminal investigation into you and your wife for felony elder financial exploitation and federal wire fraud. I have already contacted the district attorney to expedite the warrants." The lead police officer stepped forward, placing his hand deliberately on his heavy utility belt. He looked Aaron up and down with absolute contempt. He informed Aaron that he was now officially trespassing on private property. He stated clearly that if Aaron or his wife ever set foot on this driveway again, they would immediately leave in handcuffs. He ordered them to get in their vehicle and vacate the premises immediately. The sheer absolute finality of the authorities turning against them broke the last remaining thread of their alliance. Stripped of all leverage and staring directly at federal prison, Aaron and Brooke turned on each other right there in the middle of the street. Brooke slapped Aaron hard on the shoulder. She shrieked that he was an absolute idiot for using his own home network to forge the banking application. She screamed that he had ruined her life and destroyed their social standing because he was too incompetent to execute a simple white-collar crime. Aaron's face twisted into a mask of pure hateful rage. He screamed back at her that he only forged the documents to pay for her massive, suffocating credit card debts. He shouted that her relentless spending and her demand for luxury goods had pushed them into bankruptcy. I stood quietly behind the glass of my front window and watched their marriage completely disintegrate. They were no longer a unified front of corporate predators. They were two desperate, panicked criminals screaming at each other in the freezing wind, tearing each other apart under the weight of their own exposed greed. 30 days evaporated with the ruthless efficiency of a ticking clock. The corporate asset management firm that purchased the sprawling suburban property did not entertain extensions. They did not care about Brooke and her meticulously planned social calendar, or Aaron and his frantic, desperate attempts to secure legal representation. On the morning of the 30th day, the heavy-treaded tires of a county sheriff vehicle crunched against the familiar frosted gravel of the driveway. I was not physically present to witness the extraction, but the subsequent formal reports from the corporate liquidators and the neighborhood association painted a vivid, pathetic picture. Aaron and Brooke had stubbornly refused to pack their belongings. They had clung to the desperate, arrogant delusion that a last-minute legal injunction would somehow save them. They were entirely wrong. The sheriff deputies did not offer sympathy or extra time. They offered a strict 10-minute window to gather essential personal effects before changing the heavy brass locks. The sprawling suburban fortress that Aaron had attempted to steal was formally secured by men in tactical uniforms, while Brooke stood on the cold sidewalk, weeping uncontrollably into a cheap cardboard box. Their luxurious illusion had completely collapsed in full view of the affluent neighbors they had spent years trying to impress. The Adult Protective Services investigation had triggered an immediate and devastating financial cascade. Diane Silva had acted with absolute professional ruthlessness. Upon verifying the fraudulent home equity line of credit, the federal banking authorities permanently froze all joint accounts associated with Aaron and Brooke. The capital they had stolen from me was entirely locked inside an impenetrable federal evidence vault pending a massive criminal trial. Their credit ratings, previously sustained by the silent capital I had fed them over the years, imploded overnight. Without my retirement funds acting as a hidden safety net, their true financial reality was violently exposed to the world. They possessed massive, unserviceable debt. They had zero liquid assets. They were completely toxic to any legitimate leasing agency in the entire state. Stripped of their stolen wealth and facing an active felony investigation, their options vanished into thin air. They were forced to secure housing through a predatory subprime landlord who did not require a standard background check. The sprawling, manicured lawns and quiet luxury of their affluent neighborhood were instantly replaced by the cracked asphalt and chain-link fences of an industrial sector on the extreme opposite edge of the city. Their new reality was a cramped, decaying two-bedroom apartment located directly above a 24-hour commercial laundromat. The walls were paper-thin and stained with years of severe neglect. The heavy designer furniture they had purchased with my stolen money could not even fit through the narrow, rotting doorframe of their new building. They were forced to abandon their luxury items on the sidewalk, where they were quickly scavenged by opportunistic strangers. I felt a profound, absolute sense of closure as the finalized bank transfer from the cash buyer cleared my private secure account. The heavy liability of that suburban house had been surgically removed from my financial architecture. The asset had been converted into pure liquid capital, resting safely behind impenetrable security protocols that Aaron would never again breach. The parasitic connection had been permanently severed. I did not feel a single trace of guilt as I imagined them sitting on the stained carpet of their miserable new apartment, surrounded by the deafening mechanical hum of commercial washing machines. They were finally experiencing the unvarnished reality of their own decisions. They were finally living the life they had actually earned. For decades, I had acted as a human shield, intercepting the consequences of every reckless choice my son had ever made. I had quietly paid his debts. I had funded his lavish lifestyle. I had allowed his entitlement to fester in the dark. That era of silent complicity was officially over. The eviction was not a cruel punishment. It was a mandatory correction of the natural order. It was the absolute, undeniable consequence of choosing greed over blood. The absolute silence of my townhouse was broken only by the gentle, rhythmic ticking of the antique clock in the hallway. It was late afternoon, and the weak winter sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long, peaceful shadows across the polished hardwood floor. I was sitting in my leather reading chair, holding a warm cup of dark coffee when my cellular phone began to vibrate violently against the side table. The sudden movement rattled the wood, and the screen illuminated the dim room. The caller identification displayed a number I had not seen in exactly 1 month. It was Aaron. He was calling from a prepaid cellular device, likely because his primary corporate line had been permanently terminated for non-payment. I let the phone vibrate against the wood for a long time. I watched the screen flash with a cold, clinical detachment. A normal father might have felt a sudden surge of anxiety or a lingering shred of parental obligation. I felt absolutely nothing but the quiet, steady rhythm of my own breathing. I reached out and tapped the glass screen, accepting the call. I did not offer a polite greeting. I did not speak his name. I raised the phone to my ear and remained completely silent, waiting for him to speak. The sound that emanated from the tiny speaker was pathetic. It was a wet, ragged sobbing. Aaron was weeping with the total unrestrained desperation of a man who had finally hit rock bottom and shattered his teeth on the concrete. "Dad, please," he gasped, his voice breaking into a miserable, high-pitched whine. "Please, you have to help us." He did not attempt to manufacture the authoritative, patronizing corporate tone he had wielded on my driveway. He did not threaten me with state institutions or locked psychiatric evaluations. The arrogant bully had been entirely crushed under the immense weight of his own hubris. He was completely broken. He wept into the receiver, describing the horrific conditions of his new apartment in graphic detail. He complained bitterly about the relentless vibrating noise from the laundromat below them and the freezing winter draft leaking through the shattered window panes. He sobbed that Brooke had packed her remaining designer clothes into garbage bags and left him the previous night retreating to her parents' home and refusing to answer his desperate calls. He was entirely alone, facing a looming federal indictment with absolutely no financial resources and no allies left to manipulate. I listened to his miserable litany of failures without interrupting. I allowed him to exhaust his lungs. I allowed him to verbally bleed out over the cellular connection. He desperately needed me to interrupt him with a comforting word. He needed me to instinctively fall back into my decades-long pattern of rescuing him from his own severe incompetence. When I offered nothing but a vast, impenetrable silence, his panic escalated into sheer terror. "Dad, I know I made a terrible mistake," he cried, choking violently on his own tears. "I know I crossed a line, but the landlord here is demanding a 3-month security deposit in cash by tomorrow morning. If I do not pay him, he is going to throw me out on the street. I have nothing left, Dad. My accounts are permanently frozen. My credit is completely ruined. I cannot even buy groceries. I am begging you, just a temporary loan, just $5,000 to keep a roof over my head until I can figure this out and find a lawyer. I will pay you back every single penny. I swear to you on my life. Please do not let me become homeless." His begging echoed loudly in the quiet, serene space of my living room. I sat perfectly still, holding the cold phone to my ear. I remembered the freezing winter morning on my driveway. I remembered the exact cruel expression on his face when he handed me the fraudulent power of attorney. I remembered the cold, ruthless way he had looked directly into my eyes and threatened to have me permanently committed to a locked psychiatric ward simply to steal my retirement. He had been perfectly willing to destroy my entire existence to fund his luxury. He had looked at the father who had sacrificed everything to raise him and seen nothing but an automated teller machine that required aggressive, violent dismantling. I took a slow, deep breath. The air in my home was warm and clean. My reality was completely secure. I finally broke the silence. My voice was calm, steady, and entirely devoid of any residual emotion. I spoke with the irreversible finality of a Supreme Court judge delivering a permanent sentence. "I am sorry, Aaron," I said, using the exact heartless phrasing he had weaponized against me on my front porch. "I only planned for my immediate family. I did not wait to hear the sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. I did not wait for the horrific realization of his absolute permanent exile to register in his mind." I pulled the phone away from my ear and tapped the red icon ending the call instantly. I opened the settings menu on my device and navigated to his contact information. With a single deliberate press of my thumb, I permanently blocked his number. The electronic barrier was absolute. The digital tether was severed forever. I placed the phone back onto the wooden side table and took a slow sip of my coffee. The silence returned to the townhouse, settling over the room like a heavy, comforting blanket. I sat on my quiet porch as the evening settled peacefully over the neighborhood. The freezing wind of the past month had finally broken, giving way to a crisp, clear winter night. The street lamps flickered to life, casting a warm yellow glow across the empty, pristine sidewalk. I felt no sadistic joy in the destruction of my son. There was no triumphant celebration in my heart. I only felt the profound, absolute peace of a restored equilibrium. The natural order of my universe had been violently disrupted by greed and unbelievable entitlement, but through meticulous patience and ruthless excision that order had been permanently reestablished. I had not destroyed Aaron. I had simply stopped shielding him from the brutal reality of his own actions. I had stepped completely out of the way and allowed the massive crushing weight of his own decisions to fall squarely upon his shoulders. He was a grown adult, and he was finally experiencing the unvarnished, severe consequences of adult choices. I stood up from my chair and walked back inside the warm, secure sanctuary of my home. I moved to my small mahogany desk and opened my laptop. The screen illuminated my face in the dim, quiet room. I navigated to my highly secure banking portal and reviewed the digital ledger. The massive influx of capital from the finalized cash sale of the suburban property sat safely in my primary account. It was joined by the recovered funds Diane Silva had systematically extracted from Aaron frozen accounts during the ongoing federal investigation. The wealth I had spent an entire lifetime building brick by brick through decades of honest, exhaustive labor was entirely intact. It was no longer a target for parasitic extraction. It was no longer a burdensome secret I had to protect from my own blood. It was completely and undeniably mine. I opened a new digital tab and navigated to a premium international travel agency. I did not look for budget accommodations or heavily discounted fares. For 40 years, I had sacrificed my own desires to ensure my family had every possible advantage. I had delayed my own dreams to fund their lavish comfort. That era of unilateral sacrifice was officially and permanently terminated. I typed my personal information into the booking portal. I selected a first-class month-long ticket to Europe. I charted a private, luxurious itinerary that would take me through the historic cobblestone streets of Rome, the quiet, sprawling vineyards of Tuscany, and the sweeping coastal roads of the Mediterranean. I booked luxury suites in historic five-star hotels and secured private transit for the entire duration of the journey. I watched the loading icon spin on the screen for a brief second before the bold green confirmation text appeared. The itinerary was completely locked. The future was entirely my own. I closed the laptop and walked toward the front of the townhouse. A sleek black town car was already pulling up to the curb outside my window, its bright headlights sweeping across the frost-covered grass. The driver stepped out in a dark suit and opened the trunk, waiting patiently in the cold night air. I pulled my heavy wool overcoat from the closet and slipped it over my shoulders. I picked up my premium leather travel bag from the floor of the foyer. I did not look back into the dark, empty house. I stepped out onto the front porch and pulled the heavy, solid oak door shut behind me. The brass deadbolt engaged with a loud, definitive click, echoing sharply in the quiet neighborhood. The surgical excision of the toxic elements in my life was completely finalized. The boundaries I had drawn were absolute and impenetrable. I walked down the concrete path toward the waiting vehicle, feeling the cold, clean air fill my lungs. I was a man who had survived a profound betrayal and emerged entirely unbroken. I stepped into the warm leather interior of the luxury car and instructed the driver to take me directly to the airport. As the vehicle pulled away from the curb, merging smoothly into the quiet flow of traffic, I looked out the window at the passing city lights. I was leaving the dark shadows of manipulation and infinite greed completely behind me. The engine hummed quietly, carrying me toward a new, bright horizon. The silent reckoning was over. My life finally belonged to me. The profound lesson embedded within this silent reckoning is that authentic love must always be governed by unyielding boundaries. When a parent shields their child from the natural consequences of their reckless actions, they do not foster growth, they actively cultivate entitled monsters. True strength lies not in endless unilateral sacrifice, but in possessing the courage to step away and allow gravity to perform its necessary work. Restoring order often requires the ruthless excision of those who mistake endless generosity for infinite weakness, ensuring that your ultimate peace and dignity remain forever intact. If you found this story of absolute boundaries and relentless justice compelling, please like the video and subscribe to the channel for more powerful narratives.